Hello, folks. Welcome to Totally Tank, the tankiest podcast in Tankville. It's Saturday, 9th of November, 2024, and this is episode 64. My name is Rob, and I'm joined by...
Hello, I'm John, and welcome to the show where this month we're taking on both a tank and a world-leading jet boat, the Soviet PT-76. Now, if you want an excellent Totally Tank t-shirt, beer coaster, coffee mug, or cool hat, head over to redbubble.com and search for Totally Tanked. Also, if you like the show, and why wouldn't you if you come this far, for God's sake, smash those like and subscribe buttons and leave reviews because we need all the help with the algorithm we can get. Because as you might have noticed, we're not really adjacent to much other content out there. And just before I hand things back over to Rob, a big hello to all our new fans from posting short clips of the show on YouTube and TikTok. New fans means new fascists shouting at us, but that's the price of reaching new audiences. And let's repeat it for the slow of learning out there. The Confederacy were traitors and losers who killed for the cause of chattel slavery, and their leaders are burning in hell, including Bobby Lee. Hey, Rob, what does the Confederacy and Nazi Germany have in common?
What, John?
The United States Army smashed them both.
Hooray!
Yes. Okay.
But today we're talking about the PT-76, a.k.a. John, can you say this one for me?
The Plava-Yuchiv?
Plava-Yuchiv tank, which equals the floating tank.
Yes.
The PT stands for floating tank.
Just a quick hello for those on the YouTube feed. Tasman's joining us from Sydney. Cat Chant's joining us from Montana in the USA. Good luck, Cat Chant. Although living in Montana, I'm sure you're used to this sort of thing. Okay. Now, just quickly...
And Jamie from South Australia and Brandon Make Stuff.
Yes.
Welcome, both of you.
Okay. Well, good to see you again, Brandon. This tank I saw on a roundabout in Mataran in Lombok in Indonesia. And
inspired.
Yes, and Sheridan said, "What is that?" And I looked at it, and my words were, "It's a Soviet amphibious, and it's related to the BMP," which, for first glance of a tank I'd never seen before in my life, is pretty good.
And I bet you're most proud about the fact that your other half actually asked you what it was and didn't actually just ignore it. And so she was interested.
Yes, and I got a picture of it, which is in the slideshow, which I was particularly pleased to get as the taxi whizzed around this roundabout, dodging the horse-drawn carriages they're still using in a big way in Lombok. So, tiny little horses. They get very angry when Australians try to ride them.
Well, if it's an island, then it's probably hard to get a lot of petrol over there for cars. So you've got to be pretty rich.
I mean, look, there's a lot of mopeds still going around as well, but a significant number of horses. Lombok is lovely if you want to go for a holiday, folks. Recommend it. Alan has joined us as well. We'll love you any age, Alan. So you just keep on going.
keeping on. All right, let's get into the stats. It's an amphibious light tank, as John said. It was in service from 1951 till present. It's still running around today. Designed.
It will never die because it is too useful.
Designed from 1949 to 1951. Manufacturer the VTZ Kirov factory, which is a tractor factory.
Yeah, well,
they call it the tractor factory.
Kirov's based out of Leningrad / St. Petersburg.
Yeah,
and I can't think of too many designs they got up after this one. So, because they were a legendary tank factory earlier, and then they sort of fell off later. But yeah.
It was produced from 1951 to 1969, and the chassis may still be being produced. And they definitely kept on building the chassis after 1969 because a lot of different types of those variants came out after that. So basically, once they stopped putting turrets on them, they said, well, what else can we put on top of these? And we'll get to those. Number built, around 12,000 supposedly, but possibly some sources only say 6,000. Which includes the 2,000 for export. And
I think the numbers here get squirrely because of the variants and whether they were counted or not, and also the BTR numbers, because the BTR 50, the world's first tracked APC,
and nobody's telling us putting the real numbers online to really track it.
The Russians lie for the purposes of status of forces in Europe.
Mass only weight 14.6 tons, 25 feet or 6.9 meters long. 3.15 meters wide and 2.23 got pushed up to 2.66 meters tall over time. Crew of 3, driver, commander, who is also the gunner, and a loader. So
now the loader in this tank has the cruisiest job in the Russian army.
Yep,
it's amazing. He has an acre of space. He has nothing to do but occasionally put a new round in the gun.
And it's not even a big round; it's a small round.
Yeah.
But just one thing, he doesn't have the. They don't have the automatic tilting of the barrel or the breech to enable to easier loading, so it stays level of where the gun was fired.
It holds its position.
So the poor loader doesn't get the easy access to put the round in. He's got to And you got to lift the huge round of 76 mils, which actually isn't all that big, and then put her in at that level. So he does have a slight harder job.
Yeah, but he's really got very little to do and a lot of space to relax in.
Whereas the commander's got the radio, the gun, and being commander,
and the driver has a very weird position where his feet are actually higher than his hips in the front of the tank.
Right.
So because with the boat hull, they didn't have enough room for the driver's feet, so they just stuck him in the air.
There you go. Well, the other thing is that the driver gets a little periscope, but he sits right underneath the gun. So if your gun's facing forward and going through the water, his little periscope that sticks up about 18 inches, you've got to worry about smacking that with the gun as he's driving through the water. And what's going to happen there? Now,
Tasman is asking about whether the Kangaroo APC was the first tracked APC. Let's say the first purpose-built tracked APC, because the Kangaroo was a modification of an existing hull.
Yeah. All right, armour, it was only very thin. It was steel, 15 mils on the front of the turret, but 8 to 5 mils everywhere else, so only good for protection from small arms.
Very small arms, 7.62 absolute tops.
Yeah, and shrapnel at a distance.
Even then some shrapnel.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want to be blasting a blast going off within 10 metres of you or anything like that. It's all 50 metres.
But there is one interesting thing in its service history, which it was surprisingly resistant to particularly high explosive anti-tank fire. And my suspicion, and I don't have any sources on this, is that because it was built so boxy and voluminous to create buoyancy, just hitting it doesn't mean you're actually going to penetrate something that's going to go boom or disable the vehicle. So it took a lot of hits that you should have knocked out such a lightly armed vehicle.
And maybe with the anti-tank rounds, they just went straight through it and didn't notice.
Well, yeah, I mean, the jet from a high explosive anti-tank round could easily have just shot inside, and no one. I mean, you'd have noticed. But
you'd be a little bit deaf. Ears would be ringing a little bit.
Yeah.
But all right, main armament. It's got a 76.22 millimeter DS D5ST rifle tank gun with 40 rounds.
Now the ammunition, because the weight is so critical, because it's got to float, is extremely limited. And one thing that's really interesting with the gun is the early Marks had a slotted muzzle brake, which looked really cool, very Flash Gordon. But then that directed all of the muzzle blast backwards. And for a tank that is designed to carry tank riders over water and to fire while it's on the water, they realised that was obliterating their tank riders was a really bad idea.
Yep.
So then they moved to a muzzle brake that looked more German and directed the gases sideways.
Yes.
So,
yeah. Secondary armour, it's got a 7.62 SGMT coax machine gun with 1,000 rounds. And later on in 1970, they got a PKT machine gun coax with 67. They introduced that one. 19-litre, 6-cylinder inline diesel, 240 horsepower, which was half the T-34 engine.
I just loved how they said, we can't afford the full-size engine. No. Just cut in half.
Yep, that'll do.
And funny, they called it a V, even though it was a straight 6.
Yep.
But it meant that there was parts commonality. The maintainers knew exactly what they were doing with it. I assume as the KV2 engine was a double overhead cam, this would have been a single overhead cam being cut in half. But anyway,
I believe you.
I'm just guessing. Just a quick hello to John Markle, joining us for the first time watching the stream. His mental picture of us had more Hemsworth in it. We get that a lot.
I just got to grow the beard, mate.
We get that a lot. When the Hemsworths are our age, they're not going to look that different from us, though, I reckon. We're just elderly Hemsworths.
I'll go for the Thor after he's lost a few things and sitting in the Norwegian town or whatever.
Yeah, just playing PlayStation with the raccoon.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But Steve, was it Steve?
Oh, no,
Daryl.
Korg. Yeah.
Daryl, whoever it was. Yeah. All right, 250 litres fuel, torsion bar suspension.
Oh, can I talk on the fuel just briefly?
Yes.
Gave it 50 minutes of operation because it used 4.5 litres a second or something like that. Anyway, I did the math on it. Gets 50 minutes of operation. Right. On that internal fuel tank, can carry external fuel, but it's not plumbed. So it means for crossing bodies of water, you got an hour to get across because you do not want to be refueling while you're floating. with unplumbed refueling tanks. You don't want to be crawling out on the back deck with waves lapping over it and
No.
and trying not to get water in as you.
And your stability goes a long way by having forward momentum.
Oh yeah, when it's planing with its water jets, which we'll get to.
Yep.
It's a lot more stable than otherwise.
And welcome Maxie from Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
All right, operational range 370 k's, or 300, 400, up to 500 with the external fuel tanks. And they had different. Over time they managed to fit on more fuel tanks. They had some flat ones.
Had some drums.
They had some drums, and when they put them all on, they can get a little bit further. Maximum speed only 44 k's on road. However, was the 10 k's an hour swimming in the water with the water jets is the main thing of the tank.
So as we've said, 50 minutes of running, 10 kilometers an hour. You're basically getting 10 kilometers on a fuel tank. So that's almost all rivers in the world, most lakes, but you very narrow channels if you're doing that sort of crossing.
Yeah. But I'm sure the Indonesians are
I'm sure they've mapped out those channels, yeah.
Well, it won't be the channels so much. It'll be getting onto one side of an island and then hopping around whatever defences they had to get to another. And for those wondering, today we're drinking the Bent Straightforward beer. It's a lovely pale blue can, and that's what we've got in the beer tube for today. Yep,
that's the beer tube, not the beer review. That's coming later. My alma mater brewery, Bent Spoke Brewing Co. Yep.
All right.
Cool.
Design and development, jet boats. John, tell us about jet boats.
Well, water jet designs actually go back hundreds of years. They've been around almost as long as propellers, because in a lot of ways it's just an Archimedes screw. But in terms of anyone making something useful out of it, that didn't really happen. In most of the history books, it's the New Zealanders in the 1960s get the credit.
50s. 53.
Very start, yeah. And that was for basically taking tourists up very shallow rivers where propellers had hit rocks all the time. So the water jet was very handy for that, particularly as you could actually just have the jet firing out the back above the waterline. You don't even need to be putting it under the water. So it frees up a lot of, lets you have an even shallower draft. Water jets today, larger and larger ships are using them because losing the vulnerability of having to drive screws and screw shafts and waterproofing them and what happens if a torpedo hits. So bigger and bigger and bigger ships are using water jets today. But when the Soviets were designing this, no one had built water jet craft on scale at all. So they were really well
not even the Kiwis. So they were another 3 years away from bringing it out. As you say, there had been designs for it and people had tried to build it, but nobody was actually using these things as water jet boats before the PT-76 came along and said, you know what? Let's just whack it in the tank and see what happens.
And what happened was that they let them move very quickly across bodies of water. I mean, even today, American and European designs are trying to just have the tracks going flap around driving it through the water, which is slow and inefficient compared to a water jet. But yeah.
All right. So the reason why they needed to have a jet, well, they didn't need to have a jet boat. They wanted to have an amphibious vehicle because in the late 40s, the Soviets looked at Europe and said, if we want to fight a tank war there, we'll need to cross lots of rivers. So how do we do that? And they looked at the map and they said, look, there are water obstacles of 100 meters every 35 to 60 kilometers, 100 to 300 meters wide water obstacles every 250 to 300 kilometers, and 300 meter wide obstacles every 250 to 300 kilometers.
And they did have very recent memories of the Germans just falling back to rivers, falling back to rivers, to falling back to
blowing
rivers.
Blowing up bridges behind them and having to bring up all the engineering and assets to be able to cross rivers, whether it was pontoons, building Bailey bridges, whatever else, to try and get across to be able to get their forces and be able to bring the Germans to bear and able to, while they're on the retreat, is when you want to be hitting them because they're disorganized and they're not in defensive positions. So it's when they're on the move going backwards. It's a really good time to hit the enemy because they are unorganized and out of their trenches. So that's why you want to keep the pressure on. And if they can just cross a river and then blow the bridge behind them, then you've lost that opportunity to take them while they're scattered and vulnerable.
But we've also seen in the recent Russian attempts to cross rivers in Ukraine that being able to screen your beachhead a few kilometers back can save you an enormous amount of trouble. And that was one of those things this tank was great for. It could just push straight across the river and then secure the beachhead while the bridging assets came over.
So that's why they looked at the solution they wanted was, say, to have a mobile and nimble light tank that was amphibious. These could then advance and scout until the heavier tanks arrived. They needed to be equipped with more than an MG machine gun because they had machine gun equipped amphibious tanks previously and they just weren't up to the task. So they must have a cannon to be able to take on enemy armour. And thus the PT-76 was born, having excellent buoyancy to allow it to cross those water obstacles. The light tanks were also air transportable and able to be deployed to the Middle East or wherever else quickly, where the lack of infrastructure and any would be an issue for any medium or heavy tanks, or even in the Far East where bridges, railways and good road infrastructures were missing. A light tank was seen to provide a solution to those problems as well.
This is kind of what the British came to with CVRT
exactly,
a bit later. Yeah. Although CVRT couldn't swim like this thing could.
No.
Yeah.
As the threat of the use of tactical nuclear weapons became more serious, it was also envisaged that fighting in such conditions would be best done by light tanks, as they would be able to move quickly and have low maintenance costs. Oh, and just want to say a shout out to Tank Encyclopedia for a lot of this knowledge. So if you want to get more in depth than what we're going into, please go over there and have a read of them.
Yep. Tank Encyclopedia are a tremendous resource. Not our only source, we hasten to add, but
No.
they had a really good article on the PT-76. They have really good design drawings that I'm very jealous of. We don't steal their drawings, but
No.
yeah.
All right. For a recon tank,
it was not a recon tank. It was terrible.
It was for a recon tank. It had the fewest vision blocks of any Soviet tank at the time. The turret traverse was 21.
Just going back to that, it was never in its design documents supposed to be a recon tank, and so it's got almost no periscopes. It's got no none of the gear that you'd actually want in a recon tank. Signals analysis and maybe even a mast or none of that. But because Soviet doctrine said that amphibious tanks should be used for reconnaissance, and when they wrote that doctrine, they had lots of
light tanks.
Yeah, but when they wrote that doctrine, they had lots of amphibious tanks in the order of battle. It got just given the job, even though it was never built for it. It was never in the design specification. It was a classic case of creep, and it performed not particularly well, except it could just get across rivers and find things. So, yeah.
Anyway, turret traverse was 21 seconds with a mechanical hand crank, so it was pretty slow. You weren't getting that, bringing the gun to bear on any fast-moving targets very quickly. Large turret ring and a small gun meant it was very spacious inside for the crew compared to other Soviet tanks. As you're saying, the gunner had the best life of...
The loader.
Sorry. And as we said before, like the French, the commander was overworked in the turret.
Well, French in World War II designs, but
but he was the gunner and the radio operator and being the commander and having to do everything else.
I've seen someone, I can't remember who, make an argument that it was actually due to similar limiting factors, basically forcing in both the French and the Russian designs, particularly manpower shortages.
Yeah, saying one sentence in there was saying that because they'd just come out of a war, they had low people availability, and so they said, you know what, we're just going to have tanks with three-person crews rather than four, just because that's easier to get enough people for what we want. So
now, just addressing the poll, at the moment it's running with 10 votes. The PT-76 was 80% of you saying an awesome tank, and a very mean 20% saying it's a crappy POS. So we'll see how the poll goes through the course of the live stream. We'll bring you more updates on that. Because, if there's one thing none of us are tired of, it's watching election results.
We'll get to that.
Yeah,
anyway, carried a mix of rounds. So from 1950, so of the 40 rounds, as John was saying, it's carrying 24 high HE rounds, 4 armor-piercing high explosive, 4 armor-piercing composite rigid, and 8 high-explosive anti-tank rounds. This loadout was changed in 1970 so that it had 20 HE rounds and 12 high-explosive anti-tank rounds instead.
That is a much better loadout than the 1970s one. The idea that a tank commander is meant to be choosing between APCR and APHE, and, it's you just want high-explosive for light-skin stuff, high-explosive anti-tank for armoured stuff.
Yep.
Keep life simple.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. A couple other fun things we've learned about it was the Russian engine design, which was common across all their tanks, was included color-coded lines. So all the bits and pieces going around in the engine. The green is for coolant, the blue is for air, yellow is for diesel, and red is for fire suppressant. So they kept that common throughout things, so it made it easier for maintainability.
Mm-hmm.
The Russians went for water jets because they saw them as a better option than screw propellers, which could be damaged when entering the water, along with algae and weeds getting caught up in propellers.
Now, you do still have the intakes on water jets.
But you can screen those. And so as long as you're not sucking up too much mud, you're all right. And because you've got the intakes on the water jets are on the bottom of the hull, and you've got the tracks.
It's up from the bottom when it is the water.
I mean, unless you hit a mound of mud as you're driving over it in the water and suck all that mud in, you're probably all right.
You could still have issues with serious amounts of weed getting sucked up against
the jellyfish.
Or the jellyfish.
You can't watch those. You've got to watch out for them jellyfish.
Yeah. But it's still much better than propellers, which is why the whole world is actually still in the process of moving over to them. The Russians, I cannot stress this enough, were incredibly ahead of their time with using water jets in this design. Yeah,
it was the way they designed it so they could suck it up from underneath the hull. It had the two ports at the rear of the tank that they could fire out, that the water would jet out of. But if they closed those off, they had two ports on the side.
Yeah.
Well, no, they had two ports on the side of the tank that they could then open up, and so either go backwards or spin one way or the other quite quickly because of the force of the jets going one side or the other. So it wasn't a case of they were stuck going forward. No, they did have maneuverabilities for them.
Now, Tasman's asked about whether jellyfish would be like a bird strike on a jet plane. I don't think so. The problem is more them clogging the intake. If they actually get into the impeller and the stator, they'd just shoot straight through. It's not as fragile as a combusting jet engine.
Yeah, they're saying there's a reason why certain submarines don't go into Brisbane Harbour, because it's full of up the Brisbane River towards around Queensland. It's because it's full of jellyfish and they just get sucked in and things go bad.
But it's getting stuck on the intakes on the outside that's the issue. Once they get in, they're not that tough.
No, but they get sucked onto the outside and of the grills. And go from there. All right, could carry 10 tank riders, possibly even 20.
I've seen 20 in the literature, and I mean there are some pictures that we've got, particularly in India, where people are more used to crowding on vehicles. I think 10 is a more sensible number of riders. Even then, the buoyancy issues, because weight is constantly a fight for this tank. 10 is getting very low water.
But even in the water, and so around the turret. But that meant that if they had 10 on the tank, they wouldn't fire the gun because, again, they'd have to be in front of the turret, and so there could be issues with, as you're saying, the
muzzle brakes,
blasting the tank riders off, or 5 tank riders behind the turret. So they could carry 5, and then they could fire the gun because they were behind the turret and not in danger of the backblast of the muzzle brake.
The exciting thing in this design, though, is it really was designed to enter the water at speed and then be engaging the defenders while it crossed the water, which is a very exciting capability.
Yeah.
and then be roaring out of the water on the other side without having to mess around with changing drive methods.
No, there was no 5 hours of preparation before you went into the water. It was a case of, open up the rear, the water jets, and drive on in and get in there as quick as you can, and away you went.
And fire while you're crossing.
Yeah.
And in the cases where it was used properly, and we will talk about how it was used properly and frequently not used properly, it was a hell of a problem for defenders. Yeah.
Because you're looking for ships and not very low slung tanks sitting in the water with just their turrets sticking out. Right, high buoyancy meant it was not at risk as much as other amphibious tanks as it rode higher in the water. The Soviet Navy even tested them by crossing the Kerch Strait in Crimea. There was at least 4 kilometres. And a Beaufort scale of 5, where winds are 17 to 21 k's an hour with a fresh breeze, and moderate 4 to 8 foot waves. yeah, you got to. That's a lot of.
An 8 foot wave is a lot.
I know. That's what you get on a Beaufort's 5 scale.
Yeah.
Scale 5.
Yeah. I mean, a 4 foot wave, yeah, fine. An 8 foot wave, I'd really want the bow turned into that.
They showed footage of them going through it, and look, it probably wasn't an 8 foot wave, but there was, as I say, there was a strong breeze, and they were going through it, and they went a long way across.
Yeah,
so.
They did have a very good bilge pump system as well, so any water that did get into the tank through the turret ring, they could expel pretty swiftly. Yeah, but I mean, naval infantry loved this tank. It's one of the things I've always loved about the Soviets is it doesn't matter, or the Russians even, doesn't matter if they're airborne, doesn't matter if they're naval infantry. They're getting heavy tanks, they're getting light tanks. There is just no shortage of mechanization surrounding any sort of Soviet Union. That's that Soviet unit. Yeah.
Now, they went out of production in '69, but they're going to have a long life from there. Is there anything else you want to go on about design and development of it?
I think we've covered it in that it did have a what they call the weather vane, which is basically it normally sits on the front of the tank and it pops up when they enter the water. So it basically doubles the armor on the glacis when it's driving around on land, and it keeps the spray out of the driver's face.
Well, usually you have the hatch shut if you're going through anything that's not glass, still water.
Sure.
So you button down, and it's just to stop any freak waves washing over the top and forcing the front of the tank down. So it's got a bit of a bow plane, whatever.
It's called a weather vane, but it adds a little bit more to the bow. Yeah,
just stops the waves washing over the top and forcing it down, and so it starts accelerating downwards into the water, which is bad.
It's bad. I mean, buoyancy should bring you up eventually, but just don't want to do that.
No, no.
In naval terms, they call it green water over the bow, and it's a bad day.
We'll get into the conflicts. Well, the first one I was deployed to was the 1956 invasion of Hungary. So when the Hungarians said, you know what, we're not sure we want to be part of this Soviet...
We'd like some democracy, some free expression, some American genes.
The Soviets said, nah.
Like all light tanks, because it can be got to the conflict as quickly as possible, they're always the tanks of repression. The heavy tanks are the tanks of defense. Light tanks are the tanks of oppression. So when the Soviets needed to oppress someone, the PT-76s were the first in.
Well, they may or may not have been the first in, but they were there beside whatever
T-55s in Hungary.
Were going in at that point in time because they were part of the organisation. So they were the light tank battalion, I guess, or squadron of whatever the rifle divisions were.
Yeah, all the scouting groups. Yeah,
motorized rifle divisions. All right, and then we get into the Vietnam War because why not? Where the PT-76, the ironclads, or John, do you want to say this bit?
Viet Gap.
Yep, the Vietnamese name for tanks, which was ironclads. And that,
I mean, calling a PT-76 an ironclad is the most flattering thing a PT-76 has ever been called.
That's what they got though. They had them, and that's how we're using them. And and from then that was the name for all Vietnamese tanks because they were ironclads, but it was the PT-76 first. They were first used in January '68, a week before the Tet Offensive, when they were travelling down the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos. They ran into the BV-33 Elephant Battalion, consisting of 700 Laotian troops at Ban Hue San.
Yeah,
good enough.
Good enough.
The light tanks could not deal with the jungle and fell behind the NVA infantry as they were marching down the trail. However, when the tanks did arrive, they were able to rout the Lao forces, who retreated to the Lang Vei Special Forces camp, starting the Battle of Lang Vei.
It's one of those funny things that, basically Laotian infantry was a small arms only kind of force, and anything that small arms couldn't deal with was going to cause them a lot of trouble.
Well, they're probably thinking that we're in the middle of a jungle and there's no heavier arms going to be able to get in here without a helicopter.
Yeah, but having said that, even the American forces having to fight these had a surprising amount of trouble and having to bring up old recoilless rifles and the 66mm light anti-tank weapons.
They weren't old, mate. They were brand new at that stage.
Well, the light anti-tank, the laws were very new. Yeah. I was talking about the recoilless rifles being old, but
they were still That was still brand new.
Yeah. Sure. Anyway, the point is,
well, Australia was using them until the 90s.
Yeah. Anyway, my point is that they struggled with this very lightly armored tank.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. So this base was the Langway base was an area for the US Army Special Forces, manned by a detachment of the 5th Special Forces Group. So there's about 20 Americans there. The NVA attacked the camp with mortars and howitzers for 5 hours before advancing with the tanks. 3 were knocked out by a 106mm recoilless rifle, but 5 others continued into the camp, destroying bunker after bunker, with the defenders in terror as there were no weapons to engage them with. The few 66mm light anti-tank weapons, LAWs, often misfired, missed, or did not set off, or with one source claiming that nine rockets were launched and hit at a PT-76 without doing any damage. So not as good as an RPG-7.
You could argue that. Also, the PT-76s were charging across minefields, setting off anti-personnel mines without getting too damaged themselves in the process. So,
there you go.
But, I mean, an anti-personnel mine is not designed to knock out a tank. That's what an anti-tank mine's for.
Yeah. So one of the last tanks destroyed in the battle was set on fire by a direct hit with a 66mm to the engine. And it was what was the NVA's first major tank usage. It ended in a clear NVA victory, North Vietnamese Army victory.
This is odd, Rob, because Americans keep telling me that they never lost a single battle in Vietnam.
Well, this is in Laos.
Oh, it's in Laos. Oh, silly me.
It's in Laos, buddy, so that's why they're allowed to. You got to check the fine print.
Yeah, right.
In an encounter of tanks against mostly inadequately equipped infantry, it is unsurprising when the tanks win, bringing to memory the old adage saying any tank is better than no tank.
Which this is the closest to no tank you can possibly have. Yeah.
Yeah. When the forces are more comparable, things did not go so well for the PT-76s. As discussed when we were doing the M48 episode, when the NVA attacked the Ben Het Special Forces camp in the dark, the 3 M48s using the Xenon searchlights were able to repel the NVA
Now,
tanks.
the interesting thing here was that the M48s deliberately were shining those big searchlights, which are a feature of the M48, on the vision ports of the Vietnamese tanks, just to blind them. And obviously, as tank designers moved on and countermeasures to that have developed, that doesn't work anymore. But it's interesting. It was effective because obviously they put those searchlights on for a reason. But yeah,
well, so they could see in the dark mainly. But
but you give away your position, so you got to get something back. There was also at Ben Het a lot of both sides using the muzzle flashes of the other side to sight their guns. Yeah.
All right, on the 9th of May 1972, the NVA launched another attack on the Ben Het base with where the South Vietnamese Rangers with helicopters carrying guided missiles launched.
TOWs, it was the first use of the TOW.
There you go. Were able to destroy 3 PT-76 tanks without harming friendly troops due to their accuracy. So where before the NVA would try and get in nice and close in order to American and South Vietnamese infantry troops, so they couldn't have artillery called in on them. By using the helicopters with the TOWs, they were able to take them out because they have a smaller danger close area, I guess. That then forced
a much better missile too. But,
then forcing the remaining NVA forces to retreat. Over the next couple of days, they were able to account for another 16 PT-76s on that retreat.
Now, it's worth noting because PT-76 has a reputation as a bad tank, which personally I dispute. But we've had a couple of votes for that thinking. When a 15-ton tank, any 15-ton tank, takes on a 50-ton main battle tank, it's going to get smashed. And it's just not what they're for.
It's not, I was about to say, it doesn't matter how many numbers your 76mm gun is probably not going to do a lot.
They did. I mean, one of the 76mm must have been the high explosive anti-tank did penetrate a Patton turret and killed 2 of the crew, which surprised me, frankly, that a 76mm gun was able to do that to a Patton. The Brits had the same problem with battle cruisers in their navy. If it looks like a battleship, it gets used like a battleship, and then it turns out it's not armoured.
It's just got the guns for it.
Yeah, and then a lot of people die very quickly because admirals can't help themselves and generals can't help themselves using it looks like a tank, I'll use it like a tank. But the converse of that, for the blindness of generals, I don't mean to be mean to generals, they deal with a lot and they're doing their best, and they tend to be smarter than a lot of us give them credit for. but is that if they're looking at terrain and they can't cross through it themselves, they tend to assume that the enemy can't cross through it either. And this happens time and time again. But this is where the PT-76 is very dangerous because it can cross terrain that a defender might be looking at as impassable.
I want to reach back into my memories, and I think it's called appreciating the situation rather than situating the appreciation. I can't remember exactly what that means, but I'm sure somebody else will remember that for me. And that's a case of looking what's in front of you rather than saying this is what's in front of me, and then make a decision rather than without actually looking at it. So you got to see what's there first, rather than walk the ground and figure it out rather and make up your mind rather than assume that you know what it is and saying this is what it is without actually doing it.
But numerous generals in the Cold War thought their flanks were secure because there was a water feature that they couldn't cross, and had PT-76s turn up in their rear areas and cause them to lose battles. So it's worth thinking about.
All right, the PT-76s would also be used again in the battles of Lac Ninh and An Loc, and the final campaigns leading up to the fall of Saigon. So. Where they went, yes.
T-55's got the glory with battering down the
gates.
It wasn't T-55, it was the Chinese variant, but yeah, it was basically a T-55.
Yeah, all right. So they were also involved in the 1960 to 1975 Laotian Civil War. So
that's 15 years of pain we don't talk about too often.
I was about to say so it started off with the kingdom where the communist government where the Russians were giving it to them, and then the kingdom got taken, king got put it back in place by the Americans. And all sorts of fun stuff there. I don't know enough about it to be able to say. That was probably bad. That was probably bad. All right. 64 to 65, Operation Dewaka.
Tulkora.
AKA the Borneo confrontation, when communist-leaning Indonesia opposed the formation of Malaysia and sent forces into Borneo, and where the Brits, Australians, Malaysians, and everybody else came together to let's try and stop whatever was going on there. And it was pretty messy, but the PT-76s were there from the Indonesian side.
Yeah. I mean, Indonesia for Indonesia as an archipelago, the PT-76 is kind of the perfect vehicle.
Yeah, 4,000 islands for maybe it's 1,000 islands and 4,000 kilometers long.
But they can mostly see each other from one island to the other. So yeah.
The only really deep water parts are between Australia and Papua New Guinea. There you go.
Yeah.
So all the rest you can pretty much see.
You could almost probably get one of these across the Torres Strait if you had to, but
you
have limited paths.
You want to make sure your fuel is already plugged in.
Yeah.
Still remember the time, it was last year or the year before, some guy was going to get done for drug smuggling, and he said, you know what, I'm just going to drive up to the Torres Strait, get on a jet ski and drive my jet ski from Australia to PNG to run away from the law. And he got stopped because somebody said, where are you going with that jet ski and all that fuel?
Yeah,
and he got arrested. Anyway, that was a fun story. At 65 to Indo-Pakistani War, of the Indian 7th Light Cavalry received their PT-76s in August of 1965, a month prior to the war starting. So here you go, here's some new tanks. Good luck.
Well, it's not just that. Here is a tank that has characteristics unlike any other tank that's ever existed.
It's a Soviet tank, which you have had none of previously. All got. They've got Centurions. They've got M4 Shermans. They didn't have Chaffies. They had
no, but figure out how to use them, guys.
they had patterns.
Yeah. So it was asking a lot to go to war a month after receiving this completely novel, unknown tank.
And so the day they were sighting their guns for the first time was when they were sent. All right, you guys are off. You're off to attack the Pakistani forces that have invaded the country. And reportedly, the new tanks also caused a lot of confusion among the Indian troops who mistook the tanks as Pattons or Pakistani tanks.
I mean, mistaking a PT-76 for a Patton, you're not good at tank ID.
No. But then again, I mean, how many tanks are they?
But there is the whole, it's a funny looking tank we've never seen before, must belong to the enemy. Yeah. That everyone does that.
All right. On the 17th of September 1965, advancing towards Chattanwala, 7 PT-76s tanks got bogged down and they had to abandon the commander's tank. which was then destroyed to avoid capture. The Pakistani forces then took the remains as a souvenir, but the Indian troops recovered those remains in 1971, so they brought them back.
It's very, and it goes back. The ancient Greeks used to do this all the time. Capturing armor and putting it up as a monument, then recapturing it. And,
if you take your battle stands like Sharp's Eagle and so forth. When touched by Emperor Napoleon. That's all the anyway. A tank battle between the Pakistani M4 Sherman's tanks and Pattons near. Do you want to say this one?
Thati Jaimal Singh.
That'll do. Against PT-76 was going badly for the Indian tanks until their Centurions turned up, and the Pakistanis were forced
Centurions
to
always help.
forced to withdraw. The battle was fought at ranges of around 600 metres, but only one Indian PT-76 and a Pakistani Sherman and a Patton were damaged, showing the poor usage and inexperience on both sides. The Pakistanis captured a number of PT-76s from India during the 1965 war. And then we'll get into the next one.
Yeah, because they just keep going.
Well, we're just sticking with the Indo-Pakistani theme here.
Yep.
So we jump to 1971. But we're not going to jump straight into the Indo-Pakistani war. We're actually going to start off with the Bangladeshi War of Independence, which happened slightly before outbreak of hostilities between India and Pakistan itself.
This was one of Henry Kissinger's great genocides, with millions killed thanks to Henry's lack of care, shall we say.
Realpolitik? I don't know.
Well, he called it realpolitik, but it was just not caring how many people died when he thought he thought he was achieving little wins by moving pieces around the board. And if a million people starved to death, then what's that to Henry Kissinger's career?
No. Thankfully,
it didn't help. He never helped America that much with this stuff. He just made himself look good.
Yeah. Anyway, so just before the actual confrontation between India and Pakistan happened, India had positioned armoured units with PT-76s along the border with what was then East Pakistan, which is what we now know as Bangladesh, which is the border consists of the Ganges River Delta, which is ideal for the PT-76.
This is the land the PT-76 was made for. You think Poland has got a lot of rivers? The Ganges Delta is it's a lot of people, a lot of land, and so much water.
Yep. So the Indian forces had crossed the river and taken Gabripur with 800 troops and 14 PT-76s to secure a logistics support road that basically all the Pakistani forces up the road needed that road crossing to be able to support, provide provisions up the road. However, the Pakistanis responded the next day with 2,000 troops and 4 squadrons of Chaffees. Despite being outnumbered 3-1, the Indian tanks took advantage of the fog of the battle, seeing the incoming Pakistani forces from a mere 30 to 50 metres away. Up to 14 Pakistani Chaffee tanks were destroyed and 3 captured. 4 PT-76 tanks were lost.
Now, I think this is a really interesting matchup because the Chaffee isn't amphibious. But in a pretty straight fight, the PT-76 was extremely successful against a Peer-light tank. And it's the Peer-light tank that matters. Being smashed by MBTs does not worry me in a light tank.
No.
That's a misuse.
But they did say that the Pakistani Chaffees were quite old and had not been maintained as well as they could be. And yes, Tasman will talk about the movie Pippa later on. It's coming on up. So yes, this Indian victory greatly boosted the confidence of the Indian troops and decreased the Pakistani morale even before the proper war began. So now, fun point when I was reading about the Battle of Gabripur, it gets very confusing when the Indian and Pakistani infantry units are all from the Punjab regiment, but on different sides. So as of 1946, I want to say, what was the division? 46?
48, 49?
40, and anyway, as a division, there were six Punjab regiments within the Greater India, and at partition, 5 of them went to Pakistan and 1 of them went to India, and they all kept the name. So when you're reading the battle about the battle, it's saying this Punjab regiment was taking on this other Punjab regiment and so forth, and it's got a little bit confusing. But they all decided to keep the name because on the Indian side, they were the second oldest unit of the country, and on the Pakistani side, they were the oldest unit of the country. So they said, we are not giving up our name for...
The Punjab regiments had a century-old, very proud history, and I understand.
I think it was 2 centuries old for the Yeah.
Oh, if you're going back into East India Company, could well be. Yeah.
Thing, so. In later battles, Pakistani troops dug in towns and cities. The Indians then used helicopters and PT-76s to advance troops and equipment over the swampy delta and filled with bodies of water to skirt the opposition. On the 4th of December 1971.
Oh, sorry, just quickly, going back to the design, something else we didn't talk about. One of the clever things they did was to make the road wheels on the PT-76 hollow.
Yes.
Which gave an extra 10% buoyancy, which this constant fight with buoyancy and weight, that it's almost the difference between a successful design and not. But yeah.
And while it makes them weaker, it does mean you are sitting much higher in the water, which means that the likelihood of a wave coming over you on the Kerch, crossing the Kerch Strait and sinking your tank is a lot lower.
Yeah, also, I mean, the tank riders are literally probably only being supported by the buoyancy of the wheels. But yeah.
All right, 4th of December 71, the PT-76 tanks defeated an infantry battalion defending the town of Mian Bazar, but lost 4 tanks to 106mm recoilless rifle. On 9th of December, the same unit overtook the docks in Chandpur with Nepalese Gurkhas on top of the tanks.
That's a bad day at the office when Gurkhas are riding tanks across the water. I just quickly, Brandon Make Stuff has noted that the US Marines LVTP-7 sinks if the water jets don't kick on, but it can drive underwater up the seafloor just long enough to make it to shore if they're lucky. I don't often say this, but I think the Soviet design approach might have some merits in this one.
Rather than sinking, positive buoyancy. When diving, if something goes wrong,
cut the weights and go.
No, always the saying is get positive. Doesn't matter if you get the bends, you can survive that. You can't survive being stuck at the bottom of the water. So get positive, which might mean dropping the weights and going, but it means you get positive. Anyway, these Nepalese Gurkhas on top of the tanks when they're engaged by 3 Pakistani gunboats from the very wide Meghna River up to 1.5 kilometres wide. All 3 gunboats were sunk by the PT-76s, and of the 540 sailors aboard, only 180 survived.
Look, I cannot think of anything more humiliating for a naval vessel than to come across some swimming tanks and get your ass kicked by them.
Well, they were sitting on shores of this open, but they went on the water, but still, they sunk the boats.
Bad day at the office.
The tanks were then used as ferries transporting troops and material to and from across the river, but there were instances where the engines overheated and required towing by nearby civilian boats.
Which is interesting because we haven't heard anything else about overheating issues, but it sounds like they might have been run extremely hard.
I was about to say, it smells like they were having a busy day.
Yeah.
They were having a busy day. All right. When trying to take the town of Kushtia, squadron of PT-76s advanced over flat terrain against 2 platoons of Chaffies in hold-down positions. After an exchange of fire, all but one of the PT-76s was lost.
Well, in tank combat, if you're advancing into the teeth of equivalent vehicles in a hold-down position, don't. Frontal assault over the minefield in daylight, bad idea.
Up the guts with lots of smoke, mate.
Well, if they'd got the smoke in, things would have been better, wouldn't it?
Yes. All right. The PT-76s showed their worth when used properly, such as when Indian forces carrying Gurkhas, again, 12 to a tank, went on a 55-kilometre detour through a terrain filled with bogs, swamps and rivers to flank defending Pakistani forces. The flanking manoeuvre was extremely successful, catching the Pakistanis by surprise, knocking out one Chaffee, a battery of 105mm howitzers, and setting up an ambush for the retreating forces. So, on the 16th of December, the Pakistani forces surrendered, leading to the creation of the state of Bangladesh. While the PT-76s mostly met very old Chaffee tanks, with their correct use of amphibious capabilities enabled the Indian forces to achieve goals no other vehicle could have done. A total of 30 such tanks were lost during the war. Which for a
very thinly armoured vehicle in the absolute thick of the fightings is not a bad survivability.
All right, the South African Border War, or the Bush War, or the Namibian War of Independence, which then intersected with the Angolan Civil War. Both Angola and Cuba, keep going. Forces used the PT-76s against South African Defence Forces. I'm sure
the South Africans are very good. They use a lot of wheeled vehicles with big guns, and those big guns are very, very powerful. And the PT-76s did not do well in these situations.
Well, it's
less rivers as well.
Do you know what Namibia is known for, John?
Not rivers.
not rivers, deserts.
Yeah,
a lot of
yeah.
deserts, a lot of
Yeah.
deserts. So yes, while they were
not a natural home to the PT-76.
no, well, to its, it's not playing to its strengths. There, you play to your strengths. All right.
Well, good management is bringing out your staff's strengths and hiding their weaknesses.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. We'll take advice from this man, eh?
Mm.
All right.
No one trusts me to manage anything.
68, the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia, when they said, "Oh, we saw that Hungary wanted that democracy thing. We thought we might try that as well." And the Russia and the Soviets said, "No, just no."
Yeah, Soviets said, "We thought you would have learned the lesson, but no, we'll teach it again."
All right, 12 years later, we're happy to do it again. All right, first, the Six-Day War, Egypt and Syria against Israel. They included Jordan in this one, but Jordan didn't have any PT-76s. Egypt first used their 100 PT-76s during the Six-Day War, where they lost 29, with the Israelis capturing 9 of them and modifying them and putting them back into service.
Now, I do find, for this whole was it good or not argument, the fact that the Israelis put them back into service and used them very extensively suggests this was actually quite a useful vehicle. Yeah.
The Israelis, they had issues because they didn't have the ammunition for them, so they were limited in how many rounds each tank could take. So they had to hoard them a bit, but they managed. Anyway, during the War of Attrition in May 1970, 66 PT-76s and 7 BTR-70s of the Israeli forces attempted to cross...
Sorry, BTR-50s.
BTR-50s, sorry. What did I say?
70s. Yeah.
70s. Attempted to cross the Timsah Lake and attack the Egyptian forces on the western shore, but 3 tanks got bogged down in the sandy shores and they had to cancel the operation. So the 9 Israeli PT-76s and 15 BTR-50s were then put into reserve forces in 1971, but recalled to action at the start of the Yom Kippur War, which we'll get into now. It's 1973. Egypt was again to use the PT-76s in 1973 to cross the Suez Canal as part of Operation Badr.
Just quickly on that, one of the amazing things the Egyptians did, because the start of Yom Kippur went incredibly well for the Egyptians.
First 10 days, they're on the attack.
But one of the amazing things they did, the Israelis thought they had impregnable positions on their bank of the Suez Canal, and the Egyptians used high-powered water cannons to just erode these sand-based fortifications out of existence.
There you go.
And then the 76s the PT-76s could get up and over these ramparts. All
right. At 1400 hours on the 6th of October, 20 PT-76s Egyptian tanks escorted 1,000 Marines riding inside BTR-50s across the Suez Canal. By 0240 hours the next morning, the Egyptian troops were clearing minefields to allow the advance into Israel. So,
and let's not forget that in this early stage in Yom Kippur, the Israelis were trying to do what they'd done in the Six-Day War, counterattacking with massed armor, and the Egyptians had Soviet anti-tank systems, particularly the Saga missile, and were just obliterating the counterattacks. Now, Israel's a bit on the nose now. Well, we're going to have to talk about Gaza later in the show, but the way they overcame in the course of the Yom Kippur War was, this is where the legend of Israel came from, really. The Six-Day War and Yom Kippur.
Right. 10 PT-76s then pushed eastwards into Israeli territory, where they ran into 35 Pattons in the middle of the night. So the Pattons then used their xenon lights to light them up again and engage the tanks. Whatever tanks survived then fled back. However, the 9 Israeli PT-76s pushed towards the Great Bitter Lake,
which is in the middle of the Suez Canal.
But because they had to cross water bodies, they arrived late at dawn on the 16th of October. They joined, which is 10 days into the attack, so this is when they're starting to go on the offensive. They joined a force of Patton tanks with the task of intercepting an Egyptian armoured brigade towards the north of the lake. When the Egyptian forces were engaged in the PT-76s and the Pattons, another force of Pattons came from the Egyptian flank, which took heavy losses. So that was basically the turning point for the battle. Sorry, the war. When the Israelis crossed the Suez on the 14th of October, they brought 7 PT-76s and 8 BTR-50s along with other vehicles on pontoons painted in Egyptian colours, with Arab-speaking crews to establish a bridgehead in Egyptian territory, allowing for more troops to come in and turn the fighting from a defensive into an offensive campaign.
And that gets into the stuff I was talking about earlier with the ideal use of the PT-76 to screen the bridgehead while the heavy crossing comes through. Yeah.
There you go. All right. 1975, the invasion of East Timor, also known as Operation Seroja. Okay, so the ex-Portuguese, for those who don't know, the ex-Portuguese territory of East Timor is part of
Timor-Leste to its friends.
Yep, is part of a small island to the north of Australia, with the other half of the island being Indonesia. When the Portuguese left, the locals had their own civil war in 1974, with the left-leaning Fretland winning. Indonesia and the West didn't want a progressive left-leaning government in Southeast Asia, even such a tiny, insignificant one, and after the loss of the Vietnam War. And so Indonesia was allowed to invade. The PT-76s were very useful at getting around the coast and bypassing Timorese positions. It wasn't an island-hopping campaign as such, as they were already stationed on the Indonesian part of the island. So.
But it gave them mobility, and particularly the Timorese...
Fretland.
Basically, Fretland did not have heavy weapons at all. So, PT-76 was just fine for keeping their rifles out.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. All right. 1980 to 88, the Iran-Iraq War. Iraq had plenty of PT-76s, which is why they were then there in the Gulf War in 91.
And there was a lot of marsh fighting up around the Iran-Iraq border.
Basra is very marshy.
Yeah, Basra is, so there was some terrain that suited them. Of course, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers is great territory for PT-76s.
I had a fun moment when we were flying across to France last year. And I looked out the window saying, I could see on the map where we were going, and I said to myself, I can see two big rivers meeting as we're flying over it. And I was saying, I bet that is where the
Tigris and Euphrates
were meeting. I'm saying, that was a moment in history.
That's the best place of civilization.
As I was at 30,000 feet flying over the top of it and saying, glad I'm not on the ground, but I'm glad I've seen it.
Yeah.
Right. 1991 to 2001, the mess and the heartbreak that was the Balkans after the dissolution of Yugoslavia. The PT-76s there changed hands between the old military, the new militias, and any gangs in between. They were mainly used as close or long-range fire support and not any sort of recon or amphibious capabilities.
As we've constantly noted, all tanks end up being assault guns.
Yeah. All right, 95 to 99, the First and Second Chechen Wars. The Russians, the Chechen War is one of the last conflicts where the PT-76 saw combat, and we used, from the very beginning, the tanks were mostly used in front of the infantry, protecting them from small arms fire, along with roadblock escort missions. As an example, the PT-76 was seen near the Grozny Presidential Palace on the 18th of April 1995.
It's interesting to me that given the very large numbers of RPG-7s used by the Chechens, they redefined guerrilla squad combat around two men with RPG-7s and one with an AK to protect the RPGs. So picking off lightly armoured Soviet vehicles was a huge part of the Chechen resistance. But PT-76, again, like I said, I think it's mass means it essentially forms spaced armor, gives it a more resilience against shaped charges than you'd think.
All right.
Clips Ahoy's joined us. Whole lot of hoopla. Don't know, but g'day.
Why not? On the 18th of April 1995, a PT-76 and a T-72 entered the town of Bamut. Not Bakhmut, but Bamut, battling their way to the town centre for over 2 hours until the tanks were mobilised and set it on fire as part of it. One of the Russian border patrols said, with a tank, even though it's light, you feel much more confident than, say, a BDR or BRDM. After all, a 76mm gun is much more hefty than a machine gun, even a heavy one. With suppressing harassing fire from the tanks, there were no attacks on us. So they liked having a tank there.
Yeah, just a big enough high explosive round does wonders, being able to get it where it needs to go.
All right. Then again, there's a couple more actions, police actions in Indonesia, in Ambon and Aceh, and then part of Iraq still, when the invasion of Iraq happened in 2003, they still had some PT-76s running around.
Now, the Aceh offensive, obviously, the AMX-13 episode was a long time ago, but I believe they were also involved, so there was a little plethora of light tanks. The Indonesians then.
2003, maybe. All right. However, they do not seem to have made an appearance in the war in Ukraine, even if there are plenty of rumours of them being sent to the front by the Russians.
Which seems slightly odd because there's a lot of rivers the Russians are struggling to get
across. I know, that's exactly right.
A massed assault of PT-76s would clean out a lot of trouble.
Because yes, you'd get some, but the way they're sending the BDRs and MTLBs across bloody open terrain into minefields, I mean, lakes and rivers don't have a lot of minefields.
No, very hard to mine.
So you can get around them. You can just go minefield, just go around. I'll just keep saying.
Oh, well, anyway, let's not give them ideas.
All right. All right, operators. Angola got 68 secondhand in 1975 from the US, from the Soviets. They're likely still in service if they haven't been blown up by the South African Defence Force.
It's a good tank for Angola. I know that we talked about how the desert isn't ideal territory for this, but in terms of a really simple vehicle with a really simple engine, there's a lot to love for these countries that can't afford more intensive vehicles.
And that was one of the big selling points for them, is that they are much cheaper than an T-54 or a T-55 or anything else.
And can get over some bridges.
Yep. Albania got them from Yugoslavia. Afghanistan got 50 from the Soviets in 58. They're possibly still in service.
Afghanistan is not great territory for these, but it comes back to they can get over some bridges that other tanks can't.
Belarus got 2,000.
All retired by 2000.
Oh, sorry. Let's go. Benin in West Africa, in the Gulf there. Got 20 secondhand from the Soviets in 1980. Bulgaria got 250. There's in 1959. They've now all gone. Something switched off.
No, we're good. Keep talking, Rob.
We're good. All right. Cambodia got 10 secondhand in 1983. So this was after Vietnam had basically sorted out the Khmer Rouge, and another 10 in 1988. Republic of Congo got 3 secondhand in 1971.
They have got the rivers for it, but
they certainly do. Croatia, again, this is where we get to the mess of got them from Yugoslavia. Cuba bought 60 in 1970. The Czechs tested one and said, nah, thanks.
They'd had a good look at them in Prague. But just quickly, a few new people joining us. I think World War II Dog has finally caught one of our streams. And
welcome.
Beckett says chapter 1. Don't know. Anyway, nice to see you, Beckett.
Beckett CH, maybe? I.
Anyway,
there we go.
Nice to see you, folks.
All right, Egypt got 50 in 58, so one of the first people to get them, countries to get them. Another 200 in 1970.
I bet the Israelis watched that saying, someone wants to cross a body of water.
Finland got 12 in 1964.
Buying Russian weapons from the Russians in the 60s seems like an odd choice for Finland.
They were neutral. They were selling them.
They still had a land border with a hostile Russians, but anyway.
East Germany's, the various Germany's got 170 in 56. They then sold or scrapped them all off after unification. Guinea. Again, assuming West African Guinea, got 20 and 77 secondhand, and Guinea-Bissau, again, I'm assuming West
nearby.
Africa. Got another 10. Hungary got 100 in 1957. They were all gone. India, the favourite operators of them, 178 ordered in 1962. They finally finished off with them in 2009. Indonesia. Now, this is back when, 1962, they got 50. This is back, and then they eventually got 170. This is back when they were a left-leaning communist-style nation. Prior to, this was...
The Purges.
So this is Sukarno, not Suharto. So that's a very fun trying to remember which one was which. And so between 62 and 64. So
Now, quick thing in the comments. Beckett has asked, the PT-76 is the predecessor of the BMP. Kind of, sort of. The design of the PT-76 was incorporated in the BMP. The BTR-50, which was the APC version of the PT-76, was definitely, I would agree, the predecessor of the BMP, though. But,
so the Indonesians, basically, because they'd gone from a communist-leaning government to a totalitarian right-wing government, the Russians weren't selling them anymore after 64, so they then had to cannibalise and maintain their tanks themselves. They've later upgraded them to the Belgian 90mm Cockerel guns with new power plants to make them faster. Iraq got 45 in 67, and then another 200 in 83, second-hand. Laos and the Kingdom of Laos got 45 in 61, with an additional 25 captured from the NBA. Supposedly 25 are still in service. Well,
we're out of beer.
we're out of beer, but
It's a crisis.
don't worry.
God, what are we going to do?
Don't panic. Don't panic. This is not the beer review beer, John.
Oh,
but
okay.
But you need to have a look at this.
All right, I'll have a look. I've got a little bit left in this glass, so we'll.
Because we've got a bit more. We haven't even.
We've got a lot more to go.
we haven't got the models, the variants. Anyway.
So what we might go to the halftime break before we finish this tank, but we'll see how our bladders go at the moment. I'm okay to keep trucking. So yeah.
Now, that's actually a good point. Madagascar got 12 in 1983, and the beer I've just given you is the famous beer of Mauritius. I know it's not Madagascar, but it's the closest you're going to get to Madagascar.
Okay, all right.
I
think you've offended everyone there.
I'm making connections here.
Oh, God, Robert, Slovenia all over again.
Physically, geographically, they're close, right?
Yeah.
Mali received 50 PT-76s.
Yeah.
Again, Mali is not a
lot of rivers.
Are they?
A lot of rivers.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, Africa, as people should know, is an enormous continent with a great variety of terrain.
Yeah.
A lot of desert in some places, a lot of enormous rivers, though.
North of Mali is very.
A lot of jungles, a lot of rivers.
All right, Mozambique also bought 16 from the Democratic DDR. No, that must be the East Germans.
Yeah.
Nicaragua got 22 and 83 second hand. They've got still 10 in service. North Korea got 100 ordered in 1965. However, they then went on to create their own indigenous design of the M1981.
Yeah, I mean, the Chinese
which they brought out in the
yeah.
70s, so I don't know why they call it the M1981. Pakistan ordered 32 in 1968 from Indonesia, but they then also captured a number from India in 65. Poland had 300. The Soviets, supposedly.
Now, worth noting, the Poles, most of the best photos that we've got in the slideshow came out of Polish PT-76s. For whatever reason, they took a lot of photographs and made them available. So, yeah. Also, Vitaly Kuzmin, the great legend of photographing Soviet armor, features quite heavily in the photos we've got. But,
love that. All right. The Soviets had all theirs. Supposedly, by 1991, they had 1,100 still in service, some of which went to separating nations. All have been retired by 2010, which, as I was saying before, seen photos of them being brought out of retirement for going to Ukraine, but nothing has been seen ending up in Ukraine.
And if they'd gone to Ukraine, they would have been destroyed in Ukraine because an FPV drone would do horrible things to them.
Yeah.
And so we can only surmise they're not there because we would have heard about it if they'd been destroyed. Yeah.
All right. Slovenia got 10 from Yugoslavia. Syria got 80 in 1971. Uganda, 50 in 1973, second hand. So again, that's part of the conflict against South Africa. Ukraine got 50 from the Soviets, and they retired all theirs. Now, fun one, the US stole some.
As they do.
There's some.
Aberdeen Proving Grounds loves a stolen tank.
But they had, I'll get onto it later, but there's a great little video from the CIA saying, in 1964, saying, here is a tank we stole from the Russians, and driving that out. And so anyway, but they ended up using theirs as for roles in their tank training grounds with the new engines, upgraded engines. Now, North Vietnamese, 150 were ordered in 64. They got another 100 in 1971, and receiving a total of 500 over time as aid. Keep going.
Yeah, okay.
They received a large number after unification and still have around 300 in service. Zambia ordered 50 in 1983 second hand. They possibly still have 30 in service.
Now, for those watching on the video, we have got a slide showing the map of the operators of the PT-76, and it's about half the world. And also half the world by population. It's probably more than half the world by population, actually. Yeah.
Models, so many.
Yeah. Variants, that's our favourite part of the show.
These are models. We're not even getting onto the variants.
Okay.
All right. So basically, every year there was a new model, with improvements being they made the lighter hollow wheels for better buoyancy, better observation ports, easy to open hatches.
They did move to having a double hatch for the loader and the commander, so it was one hatch that pushed forward, which in terms of being able to escape a burning tank, that seemed pretty cool. I liked it. Assuming you've got the strength to lift it, it's not too heavy, but The armour was so thin it didn't matter.
Yeah, that's why they made them easy to open. Easy to use clutch and brake pedals. Then in 1957 came the PT-76B with the upgraded gun and shorter muzzle brake.
Now, almost every picture you'll ever see of a PT-76 is the B version with the shorter muzzle brake.
The German-style muzzle brake. You notice the difference straight away.
There is one picture in our slideshow showing a mixed group of Vietnamese PT-76s, and one of them...
And the first one.
Yeah.
Right, the shorter muzzle brake was also less likely to damage tank riders and spear the barrel into the ground when going down a slope.
Always a risk.
They also had increased gun elevation depression and put in NBC protection and raised the hull up a little bit. The next year came external fuel tanks.
Still not plumbed though. They just sat there.
Tow hooks and a gyro compass for the driver. Then better headlights, and then better headlights. And in the 1960s, the Soviets applied upgrades to all their AFVs. The new gun with two-plane stabilizer and a mechanism to lock the gun in place, enabling the gunner to watch the fall of shot without the gun moving offline from the recoil. This meant that the breech did not tilt down to make it easier to load, but with such small rounds, it didn't really matter. They also put in a recoil guard to stop the ejected rounds hitting the crew, which is nice.
Sounds nice. I mean, except that lazy loader just needed to be faster on his toes. But
exactly. Put in better radios, a smoke screen generator, better periscopes for the driver while swimming, and night vision, driver only. Backrests and footrests for the turret. Isn't that nice? Better air filters and dust removers, later interoperable torsion bars.
This was interesting because at the start, the left-hand side torsion bars and the right-hand side torsion bars were different.
Yep.
And then a genius said, you know what, we could make them so it's all the same torsion bars through this tank. And then the supply depot doesn't need to say, do you need a left-hand or a right-hand torsion bar?
And yet, it took 10 years to figure
this out. They got there, though. They got there. There's plenty of vehicles that they never get there.
So, yes, they could be used on either side of the tank. Travel lock for the gun, a better heater, and lastly, improved tracks and a more recent coaxial machine gun, which they went from the SGMT to the PKT. All right, variants.
Here we go.
Variants. All right, once you've got a chassis that works well enough and is fairly reliable, maintainable, and cheaper to run and produce than an MBT.
And you've trained all the people to do it.
And it can go anywhere an MBT can go. Then if you're the Soviets, you start chucking anything and everything on top of it, which they did. So the BTR-50, that's the first Soviet tracked armoured personnel carrier having the same hull as the PT-76, started out open-topped, but quickly out of the roof. I'd be worried about being in the water with an open-top tank, I've got to say, because it doesn't take much in the way of waves going.
If the waves are coming over the top of the tank, you've got problems whether it's open topped or not. But I take your point, and also just on the modern battlefield, and not having overhead cover that can at least keep out splinters is
All right, so 6,000 of those were built, and they were replaced by the BMP-1. Then we had the 2K1 Mars, where they installed a ballistic missile system in place of the turret with a range of 7 to 18 kilometres.
That was a nuclear ballistic missile system.
No, that's the next one. It's the Luna.
I thought the Mars was built to carry nukes, but anyway.
They only built
the most powerful tank in the world. Nuclear weapons, Rob. Nuclear weapons.
It was no Davy Crockett. All right. They built 25 of those by the mid-50s. Then we get into the 2K6 Luna, which was the next iteration of the ballistic missile carrier with a range out to 45 kilometres and the ability to fire nukes. 432 were built from 59 and in service until 1982. And as you say, yes, they could carry nukes on the back of this chassis.
I mean, 45 kilometres, it's better than the Davy Crockett where it was very easy to end up inside your own fireball, but it's still...
the tactical nukes, they're not that big.
I mean, 45 kilometres is getting to strategic. I mean, but it's not a full strategic ballistic missile. But
you're taking out your divisional artillery at this point.
Yeah, it'd be very... You can really,
can
really suppress those artillery fires with that.
All right, then there was the GSP tracked self-propelled ferry. I'm not even going to bother saying the name. Is Delave. Anyway, you take two PT-76 hulls, You deploy a pontoon between them, which was carried on top of one of the PT-76 hulls.
I think,
and
don't know if we've got a picture of that, but yeah, I've seen a picture.
And then you load other tanks and equipment onto the pontoon and ferry them across any body of water you come across. It was pretty quick to set up, but a lower water speed of only 8 kilometers an hour. So it wasn't 5 hours of setting up. It was maybe 10 minutes of setting up to build this pontoon that you could then drive any other tank straight on top of.
I mean, the British Mexafloat system strikes me as being a bit similar in that it's a powered pontoon, and Australia ended up getting it by accident when we bought the Largs Bay from the British, and boy, do we drive our tanks around on that a lot, because it turns out it's really useful. But yeah. Brandon makes stuff, wants it for his
commute in Seattle.
Yeah, it'd be great.
I reckon.
They're pretty cheap.
All right, then there's the ASU-85, which is an airborne assault gun, which is an air transportable PT-76 chassis with an 85 millimeter gun in an Armament casemate, so no turret.
I was going to say, if I was doing that, I'd go something more than 10 mils bigger, but I guess they had their reasons. They knew what they were doing.
But it was no longer amphibious. Why would you? Anyway, developed and then developed in the late 50s and replaced in the 70s. All right, then there's the ZSU-23-4 Shilka, the SPAG, self-propelled anti-aircraft gun with radar and 4 23mm autocannons able to fire 4,000 rounds per minute. 6,500 were built and exported around the world. So people like these ones.
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of knocking out helicopters, very useful. B, you can definitely keep the A-10 Warthogs off your back with something like this. That titanium bathtub will only save you from so many of that 4,000 rounds per minute.
All good, yeah.
And the other thing is that 4 23mm autocannons in a ground attack mode will also mess people's day up. So.
That will turn things into pink mist. But the main thing is 6,500 of them. So you might have 2 A-10 Warthogs running around, but if you've got a bunch of those guys.
Well, yeah, you need, it's incredibly useful to have, unless you have air superiority. The reason the US, aside from the Sergeant York, never built many of these is because they always assumed, with good reason, that the Air Force would provide air superiority. For other forces, having these self-propelled anti-aircraft guns is extremely useful, particularly when it's got organic radar. The German Gepard does the same thing. Having the radar built into the vehicle, you're not worried about divisional communication. It's there, and it will destroy any planes that come near it or helicopters.
All right, then we got the 2K12 Cub, which is an anti-air missile launcher with a range of 24 Ks up to 14 Ks high. So that'll take out any passing passenger jets.
I think that jet that got blown up over Ukraine wasn't by one of these vehicles. It was the same missile.
There you go. Right. Radar and missile carriers, also based on the PT-76, were part of the group. So you'd have the radar carrier, you'd have the missile launcher, and you have the missile carrier, all as part of the group. So they have to move around at least 3 vehicles. Production started for them in 1967, and they're still in service around the world today. Then you got the...
Boy, this is a reach as a variant, but yeah, go on.
The Schmel class gunboats. In the 1960s, the Soviets built a gunboat that could traverse narrow and shallow waterways, as well as get close to shore and to support infantry forces. And on the front, they whacked a PT-76 turret with a gun. That's what they said. They said, well, what are we going to put on the front? We're going to put on a T-34? No, we're going to put on a PT-76. Bang.
Which at least was designed for maritime. It was already... I'm guessing have some navalization. Anyway,
it wouldn't rust in seawater.
It's a lot of anti-corrosion measures that you need for anything that's going to go in the water.
But not all of them worked. So in 1959, you had the Object 907, which they tried to change the hull to be more boat-shaped, but actually made it worse in water. Then 1960, they had the Object 906. They put an 85 millimeter gun and a bigger engine. But the Army said it was too complex and too expensive, and no thanks. Then there was the Object 8M904. They took out the turret and put in an aircraft engine and made it armoured hovercraft.
Wow.
They liked the concept, and so looked at building bigger armoured hovercraft.
Which the Soviet naval infantry had an enormous number of enormous
very fast
hovercraft with big guns on them too.
Yep, and very fast.
Mind you, the US has some pretty cool hovercrafts too. I'll give them that.
Well, the Marines. 1964, the PT-76B with the 9M14 Well, the Utica wire-guided anti-tank missiles didn't pass the test. Then the Object 170 was a self-propelled ATGM vehicle with turret removed and 2 drum missile launchers carrying 500mm ATGMs, which was cancelled in 1959.
Shame they couldn't make that work. That would have been a fearsome little vehicle, but yeah.
Then in 56, they had the Object 280, installed 2 artillery rockets, each with 16 rockets. And more recently was the PT-77 in 2006, where a 57mm autocannon turret is installed. Also better engines for speeds up to 6 km an hour, 60 km an hour. The Russian Marines placed an order for 50, but they were never delivered. Then there was lastly, there's the PT-76
Murom Teplovoz,
which is the name of the company doing the upgrades for whoever wants them. Whereby they have a better engine, installing common parts from the MTLB, better controls to improve driver fatigue, and the standard Russian 30mm cannon turret with automatic grenade launcher and machine gun, as seen on top of other vehicles like the Algerian T-62 we talked about the other week. It's in their catalogue, and I've seen videos of one running around a forest, but who knows how many they've actually upgraded.
And we're not done yet, folks. Now it's time for the foreign versions. Just quickly, this Phoenix beer from Mauritius has, unfortunately, an enormous fault, what's called diacetyl, which tastes like green apples, very prominent in it. Basically, if you do lagers at low temperatures, and then to brew them well, you raise the temperature for the last few days, what's called diacetyl rest, and the yeast eats up the diacetyl. They have not done that with this one, so it's got a strong green apple flavour. I mean, it's still beer. I'm still happy to drink it. But,
there you go. As I said,
anyway,
we'll never get it. I don't think there's a Mauritanian tank, so I saw it. I thought, well, we're going to.
Mauritania is a different place to Mauritius.
Oh God,
Mauritania is up near Morocco and has slaves. But,
yes, that's true. That's true. Yep. Yeah, I know that. I knew that.
Okay.
All right, foreign versions. The Chinese Type 63, having received a number of PT-76s from the Soviets in the 50s, the Chinese were inspired to build their own. They didn't copy it; they were inspired to build their own. It has a crew.
It's quite a different vehicle, but again, for a tank that is still derided as a bad tank, it's amazing how many countries said, actually, we're going to build one of those.
Yeah. It has a crew of 4 and an 85mm gun. Driver on the left. Obviously, they decided they were tired of the periscope getting whacked by the barrel, and can use its tracks as well as the water jets for propulsion. They entered production in 1963, and they built over 1,500, and is still in service. Then we get to the North Korean M1981 with the same design from some design of the Chinese Type 63 hull, and then the PT-76 turret. The North Koreans started building their own version in the 70s with an 85mm gun. We don't know how many they've made, but they're still in service and running around.
You never know with the Norks.
No. Finland converted a number of their 12 PT-76s received in 1964 into driver training vehicles for their BTR-50s.
It's pretty smart.
Yep. After the tanks were retired in 1994. The training vehicles were then retired again in 2018. Legacy.
Okay.
All right. Like a lot of Cold War tanks, let's be glad it was never used for its intended purpose of crossing the Rhine or the Danube into Western Europe. Whilst it wasn't a great recon or scout tank, lack of vision and speed and too big and too long, it was good enough in that it was reliable, maintainable, and enough that it worked. You could get where it was going and had a gun that could make people's lives miserable if they didn't have a tank of their own. It was reliable and quick amphibious transition. As I said before, no 5 hours of preparation to cross a river. Just drive straight on in.
Or,
dive in.
Crappy little canvas screens, which if you're in an opposed assault, those screens are going. Small arms are going to shred them, and then you will be swimming.
Yeah. Which meant its situational mobility could achieve outcomes that other tanks could not. All right. But the important parts, PT-76 does not make it into Girls on Panzer, but does appear in plenty of video games. War Thunder keeps its amphibious ability, but in World of Conflict, it removes its water crossing ability for game balance.
Which, it's like, why even have it if you're going to do that? Because it is incredibly compromised as a tank.
It's a strategy game
I know, but
than a shooter.
As a tank, it's incredibly compromised to have that amphibious capability. And the designers would be the first to look at you and be like, you're an idiot if you're not using it for its amphibious capabilities. It's a mediocre, extremely light tank otherwise.
Right. The PT-76 plays a significant role in the 2023 Hindi language movie Pippa, titled as It Floats on the Water Like an Empty Pippa or Tin of Ghee, about the battle.
Ghee being clarified butter. But
about the Battle of Gabripur, based on the book. The Burning Chaffies, written by Brigadier Balaram Singh Mehta, and yes, there is a Bollywood mass song and dance routine in the movie, but
I just like,
but only one.
I just like the Indians writing a book called The Burning Chaffies.
But there's only one mass song and dance routine, right? So, and as I said before, there is also a short CIA film from the 60s showing off the PT-76 they stole and talking about espionage and how they like to overthrow governments that they don't agree with. So
fair enough.
Yeah, I mean that was their what they like to do at the times, overthrow governments.
Yep. Now the poll, Rob, we've had 20 votes.
We've had 20 votes,
which is a lot,
and it's not done yet. So we'll give you the poll votes now, and feel free to jump in and let your voice be heard.
This is only if you're in the live stream. The poll is a live stream only function. The thousands, literally thousands of people who will consume this podcast in other ways will just have to defer to the judgment of the live stream audience. But at the moment, 76%. We've had another vote.
We've had another vote. There we go.
Yeah. 76% saying an awesome tank, 24% saying a crappy POS. I get where you're coming from, crappy POS people, but I just think that if used correctly, which is always a big asterisk, it did things that no other vehicle, even in the world today, can do. Admittedly, the BMP has kind of replaced it in that role, and the BMP's got a very scary amphibious capability and quite big guns, and also lots of soldiers. It's a cool vehicle. But anyway, that's us done for the first half. We've got a lot to talk about in the second half. We've got the future for Ukraine. We've got recent events in
breaking up with America.
Gaza. We've got what's happening in America. We're going to give some thoughts on that for our Confederate friends. Anyway, but before that, we got to talk to John Dolan, the war nerd himself, and now we're going to share that with you folks. So I hope you enjoy it. It's 30 minutes, and then we will be back with more current events. So stick with us. It's going to be one of our better shows, I feel. All right. So I'm delighted to say we've been joined today by Dr. John Dolan, a.k.a. Gary Bretcher, a.k.a. The War Nerd. Welcome to the show, John.
Thanks. Delighted to be here. We've leaned on your expertise many times when we had an armored vehicle question, so I'm happy to return the favor as well as I can, which probably isn't very well.
Oh, well, I'm sure it'll be a fascinating little run through. So, can you tell, for those in our audience who don't know about the War Nerd, what Radio War Nerd is and where it came from?
Yeah, well, it's a podcast, quite a popular podcast, catapulted my wife and me back into the middle class when we were sort of the scruffing in the dirt poor. But before that, before Radio War Nerd, there was just the War Nerd column, and that was at Exile, an expat newspaper in Moscow, where I'd gone after quitting my academic job in New Zealand to work with a former student of mine, Mark Ames, who was the main editor of the Exile, along with Matt Taby. And we were walking along together in Moscow just before the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. And I'd been a war nerd for a long, long time. Basically, I spent a lonely undergraduate career haunting the reference room of the Berkeley Library and reading Jane's infantry vehicles, Jane's RPVs, whatever, Jane's whatever. I'm reading Aviation Week. I used to wait in the public library when I knew there was a new copy of Aviation Week coming out and somebody else had it And God, I hated those people who had my copy. But anyway, out of that misspent youth, I knew a lot about weapons, and I eventually decided that knowledge didn't matter as much as most people thought it did, because I started researching guerrilla war and how people with inferior weaponry often managed to defeat First World armies. So when the United States started getting very rah-rah about the Afghanistan and Iraq invasions, I had a sense that they were not going to go nearly as well as people thought. And this was not so much a virtuous sense as a pedantic one. It was very snotty. And I felt that we should somehow turn that into newspaper coverage in the pages of the Exile. And Mark and I together came up with the idea of this character, whom we named Gary Brecher, because I just picked a couple names that I'd known in junior high, and said he was a data entry clerk in Fresno, one of the most miserable towns in inland California. And he was an instant hit. You know, he started his first column saying, "Yeah, I know what I am. I'm a backseat sergeant." And he spoke this sort of dirt-clod language that I vaguely remembered from suburban California, which was a very oaky place when I was growing up. And it was kind of a delight to me to write that language again and to write directly. And he was a real hit, to the point that famously, and I'm oddly proud of this, when people speculated that I might be the real identity behind Gary Brecher, somebody said, Gary Brecher has more talent in his little finger than John Dolan does in his whole body. And I thought, yeah, and you know, I was like a voice that was a pleasure to write in. I'd been writing book reviews, and it was like changing from fencing lessons to just like having fights with prison fights with pillowcases full of doorknobs. And it was a real pleasure to do that. So then the Exile ran into trouble with the Russian government, and I ran into trouble with most American war buffs who loved the war nerd but didn't like his grim take on what was likely to happen in Afghanistan and Iraq. But they were grudgingly acknowledging that as time went by, he'd been correct. And then the newspaper got shut down, and we revived the War Nerd columns online. And finally, after my wife and I had been teaching ESL in Saudi Arabia and East Timor and other beauty spots, we were very poor. We'd been basically stuck on a boat in the icy harbor of Victoria, British Columbia for the winter. And that's how we moved to East Timor to become ESL teachers. And we finally were forced out of East Timor. We'd been forced out of a lot of countries because of my columns as the war nerd. And we landed in Macedonia, and finally Mark and the editor of the journal that he was working for at the time were ready to start a War Nerd podcast. And all the old War Nerd fans came back, and they brought their friends, and it must
be very gratifying to be able to reach out to people and have them still follow you and listen to you, what you have to say after what would have been a very difficult time for you.
Oh yeah, it was. I felt really stupid because I'd quit a tenured job to go to Moscow, and I thought I had it all figured out, but I'm I was completely wrong, and I I'd always sort of been uninterested in money, but when you're that poor, you get really interested in money. You can't afford not to be. So it was glorious to be able to have enough money to live, and that's why, yeah, I'm very, very grateful to the subscribers of Radio War Nerd.
Fantastic. Now, I've got a question for you about your the book, The War Nerd. Sorry, my green screen's pulling it out a bit there. Now, I think it must have been 2015. I was trying to subsidize or add to my journalistic income by working in a brewery. And there was a guy there who had been a sergeant in the airborne and done multiple tours in Iraq, particularly as a combat medic. And we got to talking about things as you do when you work somewhere. And he eventually, I said, look, here's the book, The War Nerd. Why don't you read that instead of, relying on me telling you some things that you don't particularly want to hear about how these things have been going. And he read it, and then he came back to me with a puzzled look on his face a few weeks later. He said, does that author actually believe the things he's saying? And I guess that's my question to you, because I said, well, it's kind of satire of a persona, but would you say that was the correct interpretation?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
I absolutely believe what I said in most of those columns. There were a few that were designed to hide my identity and contradicted some of my core beliefs, but they were mainly written very early. And as I went on, I started feeling that it was too useful a platform to indulge in that sort of subterfuge. And increasingly, I just said what I actually thought. And yeah, but even so, even without that caveat, I believe, or believed at the time, and still pretty much believe everything I wrote in those columns.
Fair enough. That's excellent. You might be pleased to know that with the eye-opening that he had through your book, he went on to do a lot of medical work for direct action environmental groups. So,
Oh, good.
yeah.
Yeah.
And he ended up living with me for 6 months when his marriage broke down. But anyway, moving on.
Yeah.
Moving on from that. So the War Nerd today. You are read in some extremely powerful places, as far as we can tell. There are always little signs that the NatSec establishment at least keeps an eye on what you're up to.
Yeah, we've heard that. I've heard that. Um, I can't really tell. I have only one friend who's ever been part of that, and he doesn't want me to get a big head, as it were, because that's already a bit of a problem. And he generally tells me, no, nobody's heard of you in these conferences, so that may well be possible too.
Yeah, it's a big world. But certainly, I've seen people on Twitter who saying, "Oh, is there anything like the War Nerd? Why is this the only thing doing this?" I guess to come to a question, a big part of where I see you adding value is just a straight honesty, because you don't have any skin in the game. Whereas certainly in the Australian press that covers military matters, everyone's been paid for by a weapons company, or
Yeah.
everyone's directly employed by the department or the Defence Force. And so there's very little honesty going on. And I guess,
Yeah,
how do you feel about that?
Well, yeah, I think that's true. And I think it's much more true of, say, the military correspondent working for the New York Times or the Washington Post, or the ex-military brass they hire on CNN. Those guys were telling people that the Iraq War and the Afghan War would turn out fine up till we turned tail and got out of there. And then they blamed the people who finally had to execute the retreat for not doing it the right way. And supposedly there was some right way that would involve no loss of American status. That was a lie.
And at the cheapest price. That's one of the big things is any sort of military operation can be done really well if you're willing to throw the money at it. But of course, at that stage in the game, you got the sunk cost fallacy saying, well, we're going to get out for the cheapest price because we don't want to sink any more costs into it. So
so. I mean, going back to what your friend said, I really believe what I've said, because a large part of what I've said is that counterinsurgency does not really work very well, particularly when practiced by the American military establishment under the direction of the idiot politicians who really force the agenda. It was pretty clear that Afghanistan was not going to work, that it was a very, very complicated, fractal society that nobody had really managed to make function as a proto-Western society. Iraq, on the other hand, might have worked if everything had gone right and if the United States had been a different kind of occupying power. But the United States bungled 1865. It bungled the American South, people who shared 99.9% of their cultural DNA with the Northern elite. And they still took their eye off that and just sort of shrugged and let the slave owners take control again. With a record like that, it's highly unlikely that you're going to control a former enemy that you've invaded. There are too many ways, and guerrilla war has come into its own far more in this century than it did in 1865. So there was no real reason to think that the U.S. would do very well at these things.
Especially when most of the factors are all influenced by the money that's involved. So whether it's getting the oil out of Iraq for certain companies controlled by the vice presidents of the United States or whatever else.
There's so much money in these occupations. I was glad to get a piece of it when I was hired as an English professor at the American University of Iraq in Kurdistan, in Iraqi Kurdistan. I was fired after a year, which was a very bitter experience for me because somebody passed the director some of my war nerd columns, and he just fired me on the spot because they were all neocons at that place. But the salaries they made were astonishing. And one of the first things we were told in the faculty meeting was, we don't report any of this income, which was just like telling us you'd be a fool to pay taxes on this. So that was for people who weren't even doing anything military, weren't even directly funded by the American Occupation Authority. I don't quite know who funded us, but there was so much money that 1 year in that place, even as I had this undiagnosed illness and I was sort of dying the whole time, but 1 year of that before they fired me enabled us to go back to Canada, where we were living at the time, and live in relative prosperity for a couple of years.
I am always fascinated with how these things work, just in terms of the money and where the money being the real motivation for the war. They're always stated reasons sold to the public, particularly, and then that feeds into, we're doing really well, and this is all going to end well. But it's the racket itself, and there's never any accountability, never any explanation to the public about how much was spent and where it went, is there?
No, well, I found that out in another context, which I'll have to describe in a discreet way here. A friend of mine became a contractor for a very unglamorous part of the occupation. And even he couldn't believe how much money he was making and how easily he was making it. And he said, they told me, just fly over here and we'll just put the money in an attache case and we'll just give you the case. And he added, I'm not flying to Iraq. And I was very poor at the time. And I said, I'll fly to Iraq. I'll fly to Iraq. But he wouldn't let me. So he was afraid I'd get, unpleasant things would happen. And he'd probably be sued. But the money that he was describing there for a really unglamorous, unclassified item that he was selling, it was insane.
Excuse me.
So I was asking you before the interview. So, how many countries do you think do have arrest-on sites out for you at the moment, between Russia and Saudi Arabia, possibly Iraq? What any other places do you feel that you wouldn't want to visit again?
Well, I was fired on my first day on the job in Kuwait. I was hired as an English ESL teacher for the academy training the Kuwaiti armed forces. My wife and I were both hired there. We flew over, and on the first day, some wretched little guy from Mauritius who was running the program screeched at me like an angry dwarf in Tolkien that I was some sort of traitor to what was not clear. And then he seemed to calm down and he smiled. I should have been warned, but he smiled and he said, "Today's your first day. You have to do a little demonstration of teaching. So I'll just lead you to your first classroom." He grins at me, opens the door, pushes me in. The room is full of Kuwaiti Army, Air Force, and Navy officers in full uniform. And I just sort of, it was a whiteout for me. It's like, uh-oh. I'm probably going to be okay after this. But basically they said, the guy was very reasonable, actually, the head officer. He just said in very good English that there's freedom of expression within limits in Kuwait, but we can't have you teaching here. So why don't you, he said something like, why don't you see the sights? Why don't you go be a tourist for a while? And when I figured out that meant I could leave the room, I was absolutely happy. Yeah, tourist, that's me. I'll be a tourist. You won't have to worry about me. So for the next year, we lived in Kuwait, and my wife taught Kuwaiti officers, which, as she passed on to me, was a fascinating experience. Like, they all had side businesses. That was the real occupation for them. Being a Kuwaiti Army officer was a matter of prestige. It was like being an officer.
I actually did some training with Kuwaiti Army officers way back when in my own days, and yes, it was interesting.
Yeah,
One of them ran some rich young men there. Let's just say that, some rich young men.
One of them ran a knockoff high-end purses factory in Thailand, and that was his real shtick.
Now, John, being a tank podcast, we have to ask you, what's your favorite tank?
Yeah, I think I mentioned to you that I've always been in love with a Swedish tank that I saw in I think Armed Forces Journal in the mid 1980s, because it completely surprised me. I think it was I can't remember the Swedish thing.
Is it the S tank?
Yeah, Sprutzwagen 103.
Yeah.
And it did not have a turret. It had a fixed gun that could be aimed because it had some sort of hypersensitive chassis, and you could elevate and tilt the chassis so as to aim the main gun, which enabled the tank to be lower. It actually looked like a tank that somebody had sawed the turret off.
Yeah.
And supposedly it was a pretty good tank too.
Yeah, it was the first jet turbine tank, so it beat the Abrams and the T-80 in that regard, and also complete duplication of controls done through bicycle chains, so that
Wow.
yeah,
you could drive forward and reverse, and the main thing was that until gun stabilization came along for your turrets, then it was quite good in its ability to lay on target and turn in place and be a very defensive tank.
Yeah, they only made, I think, like 290 of them, and I was never quite clear on what the Swedish armed forces were going to do if the Russian army rolled through there. But you know, the Russian army probably was never the faultless juggernaut that NATO made it out to be. It certainly didn't cover itself with glory in the invasion of Ukraine. So maybe they would have been able to do something.
Well, it comes down to your deterrence arguments, which can always be very dangerous because the greater deterrent you build up, the more your opponent needs to knock it down. But yeah, I mean, for small countries like Sweden and Australia, it's always about, how painful can we make this if they want to do something to us.
So if you can hold out for that first 5 to 6 weeks and before capitulating, then reinforcements from elsewhere might come along and join the conversation.
Or you could invade New Zealand. I remember whenever I got really annoyed with New Zealand, because I taught in a New Zealand university for 10 years, I would put on this ad that had been made up by some ad agency in Australia, which I really loved. And it was like, let's invade New Zealand in a heavy Australian accent. And the soundtrack for the Australian Armed Forces was AC/DC, and the soundtrack for the New Zealand patsies and future victims was, I don't know, Crowded House, or some feeble lyric of the Dunedin Sound, and I was in Dunedin, so that being the soundtrack of
well, it's the only way we're going to get the Bledisloe Cup back after
Yeah.
20-something years. Now, are you a Highlanders fan, or you just go for the NPC Target team?
I'm an Oakland Raiders fan.
I
have been since
haven't
the
been
age
converted.
of 7. Yeah.
Spent so many years in the South Island in the South.
No, I mean, I like rugby, but by the time I got to the South Island, I had a wrecked knee that was barely capable of walking, and I didn't want to go anywhere near a rugby game. I mean, I saw my brothers-in-law playing rugby, and it really did seem like American football with no pads, and scared the hell out of me.
Nice one. Rob, you got any other questions?
No, I think I really appreciate being able to spend some time with you. Now, if you've got anything you want to plug,
yeah, how can people find the War Nerd?
Well, the War Nerd is on Patreon. I thought it was Patreon, but because it's Patreon, you can find it there as Radio War Nerd, and you can sign up there. We are doing more shows now. We're doing like 8 shows a month at least, And I would have thought we'd run out of material by now, but on the contrary, the Gaza war has been a grim story, but it certainly needs a lot of attention, and it's always something. I mean, everything seems to conspire to give us material.
Yeah, I'd say also your coverage of the conflict in the Horn of Africa has been very important because there's really not a lot of English language discussion of it.
No, no one wants to know. That's strange. And because to me, and you guys would know about this, people think this is one of those African bush wars, and there are parts of it and phases of it which resemble that. But this is also the biggest conventional mechanized war that's happened on the planet in recent decades. And it was done with great professionalism at some points. I mean, the way that the insurgents trapped the Ethiopian tank convoys in a narrow pass and blew them apart in the late 1980s. It was a classic tank battle, and I think, frankly, there's a certain anti-African prejudice among a lot of people that they don't want to hear about it.
Okay, well, anyway, thank you so much, John, for your time. Really appreciate it. Excuse me. And we'll let you get on with your evening, but thank you for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Okay, bye.
Thanks, John.
Hello, folks. Okay, thank you so much to John Dolan for coming on the show. I hope people enjoyed that. I certainly found it quite interesting. While we've been gone, Brandon McStuff noted that he enjoyed John Dolan's choice on favourite tank. I agree, that was an excellent tank to be a favourite tank. Oblong Lemon says, bring it on, lads. Good on you, Oblong. All right, now quickly we have to thank the patrons because they give us money, and it's really important. We appreciate it. We're going to talk a bit more about Patreon in a second, but right now at our Artificer tier, we have Brian Jenkins, Chris Pezze, Cornelius Weber, Ian McGuinness, Jonathan Markle, Johnny Oot, Maxi Mixed, and Pear. And then at the lower tier, we have Anton Gorbanov, Carter Heller, Christoph Keller. They're very similar names there. David Mulvaney, Elliot Spicer, Floaty Bird, Gihuk, Hans Vang, Henry Hamid, Jay Beckman Strauss, Jamie Stokes, Late Apex, Martin, Russell Phillips, Scotch 12, Steve Matthews, and Tony L. And we can never forget Vikram Murthy.
Thank you,
Vikram. Now, moving on from that, let me just move the... wrong one. There we go. Okay, second half shows in the background for the YouTubers. So, Apple Bastardry with patrons. If you're already subscribed as a patron, don't worry. Everything's fine for now, as far as we know. If you are thinking about joining up as a patron, then don't do it via the Apple app, because then Apple will clip 30%. Do it online. You can even do it on your browser on your phone if you have to use your phone. And then Apple won't take 30% and we will get more of your money. Patreon do take a percentage, but it's pretty reasonable for the service they provide.
Rather than Apple.
Yeah. Apple are just getting greedy, and they want to force us to using the Apple Podcast subscribe function, which frankly, most of the people, Spotify is where it's at for podcasts anyway. Anyway, let's move on. Beer review. We're ready to review already. Okay, what have we got here, Rob? What have you brought us?
Once again, I have flummoxed John in what I'm bringing. I'm bringing a Wusu Chinese beer that I found in my local shops. 4% alcohol, 2 standard drinks, 620ml bottle. Production date, C bottle. Yeah, that's good. Two standard drinks within the bottle. It is water, malt, rice, hops, and products. Products.
That's a bit sketchy, but yeah.
It could be quite sketchy. It's a lot of it is in Chinese. What is it, except for Wusu and 620 mils.
Do we have any idea where it's from?
China.
Okay.
I know China's a big country,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I'd like to be able to say somewhere in China, but I cannot.
So the thing with Chinese beer is that the Germans, in their bits in northern China that they owned before the Japanese kicked them out in World War One, brought German brewing, and Chinese beer is very heavily in the German school, which is an absolute fine thing. And Chinese lagers on a hot, humid day in China are just a delight. Some of them will give you astonishing headaches, but the big ones don't. I don't know if this is going to give us a headache. I have no idea. But in terms of the ingredients of malt and rice, Budweiser puts rice in their mash. It's very common outside of Germany and China with the amount of rice they grow. It's just natural they'd use it as an adjunct. As long as there's plenty of barley in there, the enzymes are still going to process the starches into sugars. So this just tastes to me like a German lager, and a pretty good one.
Yeah, it's not bad. I'm quite happy with it.
For a nice big bottle, which looks clear on the video feed because it's a green bottle, but
it's a green bottle, yeah.
You get the idea.
So, because once again, I couldn't find anything absolutely related to Russian beers.
Mm-hmm.
But what I did find...
You could have got Polish beer, though.
I said no.
Plenty of Polish beer in this town. But
anyway,
yeah.
Yes, I was drinking plenty of that the other week when you were off at your wedding, and not your wedding, but somebody else's wedding. That I was off at another function drinking a lot of Polish beer. In fact, I managed to get through most of the fridge and make a lot of other.
Yeah, Tasman's done. You could have bought Indian beer like Kingfisher. Tasman's always helpful with these suggestions. Thank you.
I did see Kingfishers, but I said, you know what? Yeah, look, the Mauritius, the Mauritanian beer, Mauritius beer, the Phoenix was. I thought that was my
diacetyl bomb. But yeah.
Anyway, what I did find recently in the international section of the beer fridge at the local Bottle-O was Mexican, Japanese, and Italian style beers made by Australian beer companies in Australia, just in the style of and bottle of countries of foreign countries. And I was saying, look, we can see Asahi and Peroni and Corona are selling beers, so we're going to sell Australian beers, but in the style of Japan, Mexico.
Which is also funny because Asahi and Corona and Peroni are all brewed in Campbelltown under license anyway. So Australians have only ever drunk the locally produced one, but we can also brew in the style of if you're trying to grow your brand.
I don't know how well they're going to take off. But it's just the fact that they're putting it into the international section of the beer fridge.
I think that was an error.
There's not an error. It's not an error at all. It's just they're lying to us, is what I'm saying.
Well, when I say an error, I wasn't... Anywho, let's move on. Okay. Oz Armour Fest 2025. So, we're just putting a call out to all of our listeners. It's in Cairns. It's at the Australian Museum of Armour and Artillery.
Last weekend in August.
Last week, is it last weekend? Anyway, It's in August. Look up their website. We're going to be there. We'd love to
catch up with you, have a beer with you.
Yeah, go to the pub, have some beers at the event, and then have some beers at the pub afterwards, and just
ride around in tanks. You get to ride around in tanks.
Yep.
They drive you around.
Yep.
Sometimes fast, sometimes very slow, but depending on the tank.
So A, you get to ride in tanks. B, we're going to have some epic nights in the pub just talking garbage all night long about tanks. It was tremendously fun last time we went, and we think it's going to be even more fun this time. So just throwing it out there for folks. You don't need to contact us. You just need to buy your tickets, book your accommodation.
Cairns is a great place to be.
We will set up an events page on Facebook closer to the event so we can keep people updated. But
we'll just find a pub locally that everybody can go to and have a beer and go from there.
Yep. There's a lot of breweries in Cairns. A lot of breweries. Raghow was asking, can you beer while dry? Can you drink? No, the beers are confined to the commander's deck, and you can't take them out of there. So no.
But they're all free on the commander's deck. You just have to pay to get onto the commander's deck.
Yeah, and if you're paying to get to Cairns,
you may as well
spend for the deck. And I would also strongly recommend putting about $1,000 away for tickets for the rides. I think that's about the right number. But you can get away with less, but then you're just watching other people having fun. And you're already paying a lot for accommodation and transport and tickets. So,
but they can't tell us what we can do after the event. No, hang on.
Yeah. We're going to have some fun after the event. Don't you worry. There'll be some beers. Now, before we get to the less pleasant material that we're going to tackle in the second half of the podcast, a fun fact for you, Rob.
Really, John? What's this fun fact?
So the Avro Lancaster bomber has more confirmed aircraft kills than the F-15 Eagle.
Well, I'd actually like that to
Rule
be
Britannia.
I'd like that to be a good thing, because it means that the plane that was actually in a war has a lot more aircraft kills than the plane that was designed to fight a Cold War and never actually got really deployed.
The F-15 has got a significant number of kills, but the Lancaster shot down a surprising number of German planes, considering how generally useless. The fire from bombers was really useful at keeping enemy fighters from getting too close. If they hadn't had that, things would have gone very badly for them. But anyway, a bit like anti-aircraft guns on tanks. They're just meant to keep the enemy further away.
Now, just to disappoint a lot of our American viewers and listeners, we'd just like to say Orange Man bad.
Yes, it is undoubtedly bad, but it's worth noting that there's a lot of screeching going on about the fact that there's about 10 million Democrat votes.
Possibly up to 15?
Yeah, that number I've got some problems with. 10 million. Anyway, millions of Democrat voters didn't turn up this time, which is not surprising if you had listened to Democrat voters saying, I don't know if I can support a party that is complicit in genocide. Weird.
What genocide are you talking about, John?
We're talking about Gaza, of course.
Oh, my goodness. Gaza. Who would have thought?
Yeah. Now, in particular, college towns and swing states, particularly Michigan, did very badly for Harris, which says, don't tear gas your voters.
Really?
Who'd have thought that if you've hit someone with tear gas, they might not want to vote for you?
But Trump hit them all with tear gas. So
yeah, Trump did, but the point was they were never voting for Trump, but they were thinking about voting Democrat. They're like, well, what's the point? And it's hard and it's complicated, and democracy isn't simple. But you've also got a thing that I think a lot of them didn't think Trump was going to win, particularly when Harris came out the week before the vote and said, "Oh, we're in the lead." And at that point, if you're like, "I don't really want to support them," you'd be like, "Well, I'll just stay at home then." They've already got this locked up, and it turned out no, they didn't. But also, I would also say on that, I have run election campaigns, obviously not at this level. The Democrats have, well, not the Democrats. Okay. Change has been what the American people have voted for since Obama. Every election, they have voted for whoever is promising them change. And Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris both said, we will give you continuity. And that is not what the American people are asking for. And that, I think, is a huge problem, and also complicity in genocide.
doesn't help.
It does not help. And they were warned. They were warned significantly that people who would otherwise support them could not in that situation. And now they're acting all surprised and blaming the voters. And it's all their own fault. Because you know what? You could oppose a genocide and win an election.
Really? How do you do that?
So, that would seem like a bit of a win-win. Call me crazy. Let's move on from that unpleasantness now. Okay, Ukraine's finished. It's a hard thing to say. They've been very brave. They've done their best. It's not their fault. But the American support is definitely stopping. The Europeans don't have a lot more to give, and a declining willingness to give it. If I was Ukraine, I would be looking to have a peace talks where Trump is in the room, because Trump has a limited capacity for personal humiliation, as in his personal humiliation. So if he's in the room, then he will check Putin, and they will get a better deal.
He'll fight like hell to make sure that he looks good.
Yeah, and you've got to go on those crappy, awful spray tan coattails. That would be my strong advice for them. The other thing is that the Ukrainian defenders know their stuff now. They're not stupid, and they've got the internet. So now is a time for the Russians to move the line of control forward. They're already accelerating into the attack here. Because normally, assaults make some early breakthroughs and then decline to culmination. But the Russians, since the start of the year, have been taking more ground every week and faster, particularly because of the Kursk distraction that has drained out the best troops that Ukraine had. And we'll get to more on that. But it's it's really tough for Ukraine. I am sorry for them, but fundamentally trusting the US has not been a great strategy for anyone.
Well, Tasman, I like to think that Europe will step up, but let's face it,
we'll see. I hope I'm wrong. I hope you're right.
Yeah.
Okay.
We've been disappointed and heartbroken so many times that we're looking at the worst situations now rather than the best.
I would also say that much as I loathe Trump, and I know him for the criminal rapist, liar that he is, if he blows the whistle on this war and ends it at the current lines of control, that is better than the Biden-esque strategy of just giving Ukraine enough to keep bleeding them out for years and years.
Without setting off, getting the Russians in to actually do something stupid.
Yeah, but also never giving Ukraine enough capacity to actually achieve victory.
No, you're not allowed to use these weapons for the 600 kilometre range that they're designed for. You're only allowed to use them for 300 kilometres, which is only allowed, which only does certain stuff.
Now, moving on, Netanyahu was a huge winner, and it's annoying because he's engineered a lot of this situation, and the corpse emperor known as Joe Biden has been totally suckered in by it. The moment where he went on Seth Meyers and said, "I am a Zionist," I can remember I just turned my television off, and I wasn't the only one. And then he went for ice cream. But so Netanyahu's going to be the winner there because Trump is going to let him do whatever he wants, and that's genocide. And at the best, it's ethnic cleansing in that the whatever's left in Gaza has to move out so that the Israelis can build resorts on the Strip and also sell off the oil and gas rights. Yay. All right. And it gets better because the tech billionaires are going to run wild because what we've seen is an auction between two mobs of genocidal billionaires. And they're waiting for the AI bubble to burst and the whole world economy to crash. But until then...
And do you think crypto will step in and make everything better?
Well, crypto's the last bubble, you know. But it's worth noting that the chair of the Senate Banking Committee got sniped by the crypto bros who put a record amount of money into that Ohio Senate race. So that's awful. It turns out that letting unlimited amounts of money into your democratic systems might be a bad idea.
What a surprise. And I'm kind of glad that we haven't quite got there in Australia. And the ACT at least we've
got spending limits per candidate, $40,000. Yeah. And it's worth also noting while we're talking about big picture stuff, and I think let's try and get Albert Palazzo on the show soon to talk about climate change and war. Anyway, every gain of renewable energy in the world, and I think it's something like 200 gigawatts are being added every month in renewable energy, is being consumed by cryptocurrency and large language model artificial intelligence. They're just boiling lakes to make bad art and nothing. It's pretty depressing. Yeah. Now, I just want to quickly offer the advice that Democrats need to stop offering the public more of the same because no one wants it. And the American public's been voting for the promise of change since Obama, which I mentioned earlier.
No. My contribution is they'd rather have a sex-offending criminal fascist than a brown woman. And at least Australia will probably be able to save $360 billion when Trump cancels the AUKUS sub-agreement. Personally, I've kind of broken up with America and I'm cutting them out of my socials, and I'll soon be selling vials of my liberal progressive tears on eBay in order to fund my new prepper lifestyle. So good luck, America. Thoughts and prayers are with you. That's pretty much.
Okay.
Thoughts and prayers, because just like a primary school shooting victim, that's what you're getting.
Trump is going to be awful, and more to the point, the people around him are even more awful than he is, which is really saying something. But at least he is squeamish about wars. If the last presidency,
I was about to say the one thing the policy he does have that I'd like to think he actually tries and keeps to do is it says he's going to stop the wars and he's not going to start any more. If he can do that, even if it's bad,
well, it's bad for America, but it might be good for the rest of the world.
Yeah. I think that's one thing that's the one policy that he's got. That I'm saying, well, that's not a bad thing.
Also, I mean, the neocons came in hard for Harris through particularly the Cheney family, which was what strategist in the Democrats thought the Cheney family was going to win the election for them.
Well, they're trying to bring over those votes, but
it
didn't work.
Turns out they should have gone for the votes who are otherwise already voting Democrat before they started consulting. Anyway, let's move on. Aussie Abrams to Ukraine. Yeah, the biggest contribution of modern MBTs to Ukraine in the war so far.
Really?
Well, yeah, it was only 30. The Leopard 2s,
I was about to say
maybe.
Leopard 2s. There's probably a lot more Leopard 1s out there.
I wouldn't call them modern, the Leopard 1s, but
true.
And no single country gave a lot of those. Anyway, there's 49, I think, Australian Abrams supposedly going to Ukraine. Well, I'm not sure if they'll get there before the war ends at this point, but
we've got 59 in Australia, so just be aware, boys and girls. Australia does not have a lot of Leopard Abrams tanks. So the A1, SEP3, whatever we've got.
The new ones coming in.
The new ones coming in. We're getting 59 of those. Of the old ones, I think we had about 80, 79. Those are going to Ukraine. So
it's a significant number of Abrams if they get there before the war ends, which is now highly in doubt. There is also the issue that, as I understood it, we were supposed to be sending those tanks back to the US in exchange for the new batch. So they're really technically American tanks that have had the good stuff ripped out to sell to provincial hicks like us. But
whereas
now they can go to Ukraine.
Whereas the new versions are the same as what the American army is using.
Still don't have the depleted uranium, I don't think.
No, we're not allowed to have depleted uranium armor or rounds, but all the other electronic gear is the same, which is better than most other countries.
Yep. Now, there was a story in the Warzone, which twz.com strongly recommended as a source for. It's a bit gee whiz bang, and it's very American centric, but it has a lot of good information. They were talking about there's a plan for having incoming artillery rounds from US 155 millimeter artillery systems networking with each other and coordinating their descent as they come down from altitude. So the idea is that they can be like, oh, there's one tank over there. One of them says, I'll take that one. And the next one says, I'll take that vehicle over there.
Because they've already got the situation whereby they can fire like 3 rounds off and have all those 3 rounds
time on target.
Yeah, hitting at the same time. So obviously they're just saying, well, rather than all hitting the same target, why don't we make sure that one of the rounds is hitting this target, one's hitting that, and one's hitting that one all at the same time. So whatever defenses they've got, don't have time to basically get inside their OODA lip and be over.
Sure, but the thing with these is they're meant to have some AI and figure out what their targets are as they're descending. Now the problem with this is that a 155mm shell is reasonably large, but in a electronic warfare scenario, they're what we would call small sensors and emitters, which makes them very vulnerable to jamming. And if you're relying on in your system on these things communicating with each other to coordinate their attack, you're in some trouble in a contested
which is what we were talking about before a couple of episodes ago about getting a non-GPS guided artillery round coming in is what people want to try and get to.
Yeah, I mean, inertial guidance chips are tiny these days. And inertial guidance will, for artillery purpose, what's this saying? Close enough for horseshoes and hand grenades. I think simpler systems might be the go. Yes.
US APS to have blackjack and hookers. Tell me more about this, John. I want to know because.
So the US is saying, the trophy system that the Israelis have got, it's fine. But the US system that they're developing to have their own one and not have to buy the Israeli trophy system, it's going to be better.
Going to be better.
It's going to be better. And in particular, it's going to have better sensors, and it's going to have better reloading, and it's going to be able to do the whole 180-degree arc, so that.
So it's not going to actually have blackjack or hookers.
No, but it's
going to have bells and whistles that nobody else.
They're promising features without delivering them.
It's a concept of a plan, is it?
Yeah, it's a concept of a plan.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I'm glad. Concept of a plan is a good thing for America to have these days.
Well, particularly with the current leadership, isn't it? Now, North Korean troops going to the Norks. The Norks are on their way, and we love Norks around here, don't we? On TikTok, we've got 10% female viewers as opposed to our 0.5% everywhere else. So on your TikTokers.
Yeah.
Um,
All right, they're being deployed in Ukraine in support of Russia. And a lot of people are putting up the headlines of unprecedented, as many claim. But as we've said before, the North Koreans actually have fought in a number of wars, starting with the Yom Kippur War in 73. And I think it was the T-64 episode where we mentioned that before Ukraine itself had a large population of Koreans who'd been basically displaced from elsewhere in Russia and basically moved to Ukraine.
Now, there is also the issue with people going like, this violates treaties and international law. In particular, if the Russians deploy the North Koreans in Kursk, which is Russian territory, recognized Russian territory, then they are simply assisting an ally with an incursion into its territory. So under international law, the North Koreans, if they were deployed in Kursk, would be A-OK. And all of these other bedwettings are not, pertinent. And I just don't think they need to, because they need more troops in Kursk, so put them there.
They just need somebody in Kursk,
Yeah, and then that frees up Russians for the increasingly accelerating assault in Donbass. But now, one thing that I have heard that might be American propaganda, apparently the North Koreans being deployed into Russia, some kind Russians have shown them the internet and where to find the naked ladies. And the North Koreans are very excited to see videos of naked ladies, and men, and interactions between the two. I'll leave that to.
Right. The other fun one. This was a month ago when I remember writing it in. Was Russia was then trying to spread lies that Ukraine is developing nukes to use against them. So that was before Trump got elected, and so obviously they're not worried about that these days. They're just trying to basically spruik up anything to be able to say, look, Ukrainians, they're doing bad things.
I mean, it's worth remembering Ukraine did have a significant nuclear industry
and gave them up,
and gave them up, but also gave the North Koreans their rocket technology and their nuclear technology. So Ukraine will be a little betrayed by North Korea at the moment, because they've given the North Koreans a lot. But it was the Obama administration that failed to honour the security guarantees that were given to Ukraine in exchange for giving up its nuclear weapons. Well, in 2014 they betrayed them. The nuclear weapons agreement was back in the 90s.
92.
Okay, now, go on, Rob.
All right. There's been a lot of talk about Japan being invited to join AUKUS. This is the nuclear subs for Australia, from the UK and the US. May not be all. They might not be getting their own nuclear subs, but like various treaties that Australia has signed with the US and UK, it might be just a case of, look, we really like the way you guys go about things, and so we'd like to make sure you're on board on our team rather than on anybody else's team when things start happening. But that then goes to, so Japanese politicians and or decision makers have been shown around various places. But that then goes to a fire at the UK sub factory.
Barrow-in-Furness. Also known as Maggie's Farm, because Margaret Thatcher built it.
There you go.
The fire is, you would imagine, a smallish setback, but shipyard fires can take years to sort out. That's worth noting. Inviting Japan, I think there's just an issue for the American submarine makers. Japan's conventional submarines using lithium batteries for sustainment are getting really good, and sending.
I think we decided to buy those in 2015.
Well,
somebody should have written an article about that.
Australian sailors didn't like the short bugs.
Yeah, somebody should have written an article about
that.
You
did write an article about that.
You did write an article about that.
The problem was Japan's submarines are real and so have real limitations, and Australia wanted fantasy. Anyway,
Anyway, there was a fire at the factory where the subs that we'll never get has happened, and now it's going to be even longer until we never get them. Hyundai's hydrogen tank.
Yeah, so Hyundai's unveiled a hydrogen tank. Now, lots of people sent me a link to this, and weirdly enough, just quite recently, I was working in the office of the minister in the local government who was handling Hyundai had a trial plant producing hydrogen for hydrogen fuel cell cars here in Canberra, which was, there's only a couple of these facilities in the world. So
Canberra had one of the first.
Yeah, we did. And the one thing that we learnt that everyone pretty much already knew is that the problem with hydrogen is it's relatively simple to produce hydrogen with a current. I did it when I was like 12 years old to make a little fireball I sent up into the sky. So you can put electricity into water with an anode and a cathode and split it into...
Separate the two out and then light one on fire.
Yeah, split into hydrogen and oxygen. That's easy. Liquefying the hydrogen to make it useful for transport and fuel takes a colossal extra amount of energy. Now, the liquefied gas industry worldwide uses an enormous amount of its own gas to do the liquefaction. That's how they make it economical, because the stuff's sitting with them already.
Australia being one of the highest,
second biggest exporter in the world.
Exporter of, and which we get the least amount of money for. Just putting that out there. That
because we've always just been bitches for the petroleum industry.
Yeah. So basically, we produce the most liquid natural gas in the world, and yet we get the least amount of money for it because we let the overseas.
Even Qatar and Norway are very good at getting money out of the process, and we're not.
Anyway. And Queensland, who just brought in a new government, are going to get rid of the $6 billion that they get from that company, from that industry. That's the one promise they made. So I just want to point out that one of our biggest states has said, you know what, we don't like $6 billion, which is the least amount they could get for producing so much liquid natural gas. They're going to say, you know what, we don't want that. We're going to take that out of the coffers, and we're not going to cut out services or public servants or anybody else who does jobs for the government.
Now, just moving back to the hydrogen tank, what I'm getting at is that you might be able to, with a whole bunch of solar panels and a water supply, be able to fuel up one tank. But doing serious numbers of tanks, it becomes problematic. Where renewables are going to be incredibly transformative for militaries is handling the air conditioning in a base. And powering the systems and not having to drag diesel in to run the generators.
And or being on a remote location and saying not having to provide diesel or infrastructure out to that remote location, because Australia is a big country with a lot of remote areas.
Not just Australia, but worldwide. Renewables for military bases, particularly with some batteries to get them through the night, are going to make a lot of sense and be very preferable. In terms of actually running a vehicle, putting the electricity in the battery is always going to beat out hydrogen as the better way to do it. In terms of running a combat vehicle, putting the energy in a battery might be the future. But as long as you can burn petroleum, you're probably going to choose to do that.
Because there's so much support for it. I mean, until there's a revolution in that. Anyway. Once again, I tried out ChatGPT to write a totally tanked script for today's episode, and it gave me Max and Lila today, or Tom and Carl. It keeps calling us tanked talk and thinks we drink spirits rather than beer. Well, I don't know why. We talk about the beer all the time. But actually did provide some details on the PT-76 this time, which shows that it is, as a large language model, it is slowly learning. And with that, John.
But as they learn, they add hallucinations. But I think that means we're done. So thank you so much, everyone who's stuck with us through what is going. It's not quite as long as the Churchill episode, but it's pretty close. All right, folks. Thank you so much. And we will be back in a month, about a month.
Yeah, about a month.
With the tank. Do get in touch with us on social media with suggestions for the next tank, because we haven't made up our mind. Although we are hearing everyone's CV90.
Ooh, Swedish?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Maybe. Never know, you're lucky in the big city.
Let's see if we can find a Swedish beer. All right.
All right. And on that note, farewell, folks.
Thank you very much. Take care. Save.